If your eyes are already closed, let your breathing slow down just a little more. Let your shoulders relax, and allow the weight of the day to dissolve quietly into the background as you settle into this moment. Maybe you've come here because you need a story, not just any story, but something that takes you away from the usual noise of the world, something that lets you drift softly into sleep while still learning something real, something human. I'd like to invite you to do a little check-in before we begin tonight's journey. Where are you listening from right now? Are you in a city apartment, lights flickering from the window blinds? Or maybe in a small village house where everything has gone quiet except for the sound of the wind? Are you in your bedroom, or perhaps on a couch, curled up under a blanket with your phone screen dimmed? What country are you in? Are you listening from the UK? Perhaps from Pakistan, India, Canada, Australia, or some other country entirely? And what time is it right now for you? Is it just past midnight? Is it 3 a.m.? Or perhaps you've caught this story right before dawn, that special time when the world is still and only the softest sounds exist? Take a moment and think about it, or let me know in the comments if you feel like sharing. I love reading where listeners are tuning in from their cities, their small towns, the corners of the world where stories like this find a home. And before we start, may I gently remind you to subscribe to this channel? It helps me keep bringing you more calm history, deeper human stories like the one you're about to hear. You can also share this video with someone you think might need a calm night, someone who might need to learn a little history while drifting off to sleep. Now, close your eyes if you haven't yet. Adjust your blanket or pillow, and let's begin. Our story tonight isn't about dates and battle maps. It's about what it truly felt like to be a pilot in World War II, the things no textbook ever really describes. The story starts in December of 1943, on an airfield somewhere in the English countryside, where frost lies like cracked glass across the ground, and the cold bites deep into the skin beneath thin leather gloves. Lieutenant James Holloway stands quietly beside his Supermarine Spitfire, breath curling in soft clouds from his lips, eyes scanning the runway in front of him. It's early morning, around 06:00 hours, the kind of cold morning where your teeth ache if you breathe too fast. Around him, other young men move silently, performing the same rituals they do every day before taking off into the sky. There is no chatter, no laughter, only the quiet preparation that comes before danger. James checks his harness 3 times, not because it's loose, but because it's part of the ritual, part of the illusion of control. His gloves are tight, his goggles cleaned carefully, lenses shining with the last remnants of moonlight. He reaches into his pocket and touches a small silver coin, a charm given to him the night before by Emily, the woman he writes letters to but never sends. "For luck," she whispered, though they both knew luck had little to do with war. Around James, other pilots perform their small superstitions. One taps the side of his helmet 3 times. Another whispers the name of his mother under his breath. Someone else presses a finger briefly to the cold metal of the cockpit before climbing in, as if blessing the machine that will carry him through the sky. There is no room for bravado here, no boasting about kills or victories. The air is too heavy for that. The mechanics finish their checks, their faces pale in the morning light, hands stained with oil. Tommy, a mechanic assigned to James's plane, gives him a small nod. They stopped saying goodbye weeks ago. It's considered bad luck. James steps toward the cockpit, the plane gleaming faintly in the gray dawn, its invasion stripes painted hastily on the wings, paint chipping from the cold. He climbs in with practiced ease, folding himself into the cramped space like a man slipping into a second skin. The seat is hard, smelling of leather and sweat. He adjusts his oxygen mask, feels the cool rubber against his cheek. His fingers trace the controls: throttle, rudder pedals, altimeter. He knows every groove, every notch by heart, but he checks them anyway. It's part of staying alive. His stomach is empty. No one eats much before a mission, not because of fear exactly, but because war has a way of turning appetite into a distant memory. The control tower crackles in his ear. Engage. Engines. James flips the ignition. The propeller starts turn, slow at first, then faster. Coughing once, sputtering, then catching into a low roar that shakes the frame of the aircraft. The vibrations travel through the seat and into his bones. This is when fear usually begins, not in the dogfight, not when bullets fly, but right now, in this moment before the wheels leave the ground. He breathes in slowly, holds it, lets it go. The engine's hum becomes a part of his breathing. His hands are steady now, his mind slipping into that strange calm that comes only when there is no turning back. Outside the cockpit, the other planes are lining up on the runway. Young men just like him, boys mostly barely 20 years old, with eyes that have seen too much. Some of them won't come back today. Maybe James won't either. But there's no time to think about that now. His instructor's voice echoes in his mind. The sky isn't blue, lads. It's black. Even when it looks blue, it's still black underneath. Never forget that. It wasn't meant to scare them. It was meant to keep their heads clear. The sky is not a playground. It's a machine breaker, a widowmaker, and you must respect it. James touches the coin in his pocket again, feels the cold metal press against his chest. He thinks of Emily. He thinks of his sister Claire, who is 11 years old and has no idea where he is. He's written her letters she'll never see, because his mother hides them away. No child should read about tracer fire or what it feels like when a friend doesn't come back. The plane begins to taxi. The wheels crunch over frozen grass, and the mechanics step back. No one waves. No one smiles. The runway stretches ahead, a narrow path into the unknown. James grips the stick, breathes in through his nose and out through his mouth. His gloves press against the familiar grooves of the controls. His eyes narrow against the cold. The sky is gray, low clouds hanging like curtains, but soon he'll be above them in that cold, silent place where the earth disappears and only the hum of the engine keeps you company. His heart beats slowly now. Calm is survival. Panic is death. The throttle moves forward under his hand. The engine growls deeper, the propeller slicing the air faster, and the plane begins to roll, faster and faster, the ground becoming a blur beneath him. And then wheels lift, the earth falls away, and the Spitfire is in the sky. James Holloway, Royal Air Force pilot, closes his eyes for just a second, says his sister's name under his breath, and lets the cold, thin air fill his lungs as he climbs toward the black underbelly of the sky. The sky, once a familiar ceiling to everyday life, transforms into something entirely different when you are inside it, strapped into a thin aluminum shell, soaring thousands of feet above the earth, with nothing but the thrum of the engine and the pulse of your breath to keep you company. For pilots like Lieutenant James Holloway, the air itself becomes an entity, something alive, something that wraps around you like a cold whisper, testing your resolve every second you spend suspended between life and death. As the Spitfire climbs higher, the vibrations in the cockpit smooth out, but the cold intensifies, seeping through layers of leather and wool until it kisses the skin beneath. James shifts slightly in his seat, adjusting the oxygen mask tightly over his face, the rubber edge pressing softly against his cheekbones. His goggles reflect faint images of clouds passing by, pale streaks against a darker sky. There's a rhythm to being up here, a pattern of thoughts and rituals that every pilot develops to survive, not just the physical dangers, but the mental ones, the creeping isolation, the relentless possibility of sudden death. For James, part of that ritual is controlling his breath. In through the nose, out through the mouth, slow and measured, never hurried. If you let your breath get away from you, panic follows, and panic at 20,000 feet is a death sentence. He remembers his first time in combat airspace, how his lungs tightened without permission, how the horizon seemed to tilt, and how he'd nearly blacked out from forgetting to breathe. That's when he learned to create small ceremonies in his mind. Breath in, check the compass. Breath out, check the altimeter. Glance at the fuel gauge. Whisper a name, Emily or Claire, or sometimes just his own, to remind himself he was still here, still tethered to something human. The radio crackles softly in his ear, a familiar sound that feels more like background noise now than communication. Bits of chatter flow through the static. Other pilots reporting positions, acknowledging commands, speaking in clipped, calm. Voices designed to hide the tremble beneath. Red leader, this is Blue 3, maintaining altitude, no contact. James doesn't respond yet. His role at this moment is to hold position, eyes scanning the sky for threats while his hands remain. Light on the controls. Beneath him, the countryside stretches out like a patchwork quilt. Rivers threading through fields, small villages asleep under the early morning mist. Somewhere down there, life goes on. People bake bread, milk cows, kiss their children goodbye. Before school, but up here, in this cold cathedral of sky, time feels different, stretched thin like paper, like paper. He adjusts the trim, small movements keeping the plane level, his gloves brushing the dials with practiced ease. His mind drifts for a moment to the letters he never sends. Every pilot writes them, folded pieces of paper stuffed into jacket pockets, or left in lockers, words meant for mothers, fathers, lovers, or siblings, apologies for things not yet done, promises for futures that might never happen. James's latest letter to Claire sits folded in his barracks drawer, words written carefully, lines crossed out and rewritten, because how do you tell an 11-year-old about war without breaking something inside her? His mother will hide it. Again, keep it from Claire until the war is over, if it ever ends. A squadron forms a loose V shape in the sky, each plane a small silhouette against the rising sun. The silver coin in James's pocket shifts slightly as the plane banks left. A gentle tilt of the wings that feels almost like a dance. He thinks of Emily's hands, how she pressed the coin into his palm last night, eyes glassy with unshed tears she refused to let fall. "Come back," she'd whispered, and he'd nodded, knowing full well that promises like that are empty in war. Up here, in the cockpit, those moments replay like film loops. Emily's face, Claire's laughter, the scent of cold metal mixed with oil, the hum of the engine that feels like part of his heartbeat now. His instructor's words echo again. The sky is black under the blue. It's a warning against letting beauty fool you, because dogfights can happen in seconds. Death can come in flashes, and the same clouds that look like cotton can hide enemy aircraft ready to tear you apart. James scans the horizon, eyes sharp, breath still slow. He's learned to see not just with his eyes, but with his whole body, to feel shifts in the air, to sense danger before it fully appears. Below, the landscape slides by unnoticed by most people, but pilots see every detail: the shadow of a church steeple, the curl of smoke from a farmhouse chimney, the glint of sun off a river bend. Each of these tiny pieces of the world becomes a marker, a reference point, to remind him that the earth is still there, still spinning even when he feels detached from it. His right glove taps the compass once, another ritual. Tap for luck. Tap to stay focused. Tap to remind himself that orientation matters when the sky offers no natural boundaries. A voice in his ear interrupts the rhythm. Red leader, unidentified aircraft at 3 o'clock high. James's muscles tighten slightly, but his breath remains even. He adjusts the throttle, scans the sky to the right, eyes narrowing against the glare. High above, a speck moves against the pale backdrop, distant but approaching. His training kicks in, calm and automatic. Identify, assess, decide. The plane's silhouette sharpens as it draws closer, revealing itself as friendly and American. Bomber formation. B-17s lumbering slowly through the sky, their bellies filled with payloads destined for enemy factories. Relief softens his shoulders for a brief moment, but only a moment, because danger in the sky is never far away. The formation passes beneath him, a slow-moving flock of steel birds, and James watches them go, wondering about the men inside sweating. Behind gun turrets, eyes scanning for fighters, counting minutes until they can return to base. He knows some of them won't make it back. The bomber crews have it rough in a different way. Long hours in freezing cabins, flak tearing through fuselages, engines catching fire, parachutes blooming like ghost flowers in the sky. James's job is different, faster, and more solitary. But the risks feel just as sharp. His left hand adjusts the throttle again, the engine responding with a smooth growl. He takes a deep breath, lets it out slowly, fogging the inside of his mask for a second before it clears. Breathing is survival up here, not just for oxygen, but for sanity. His instructor once told him, "Control your breath, control your mind." James repeats that silently as he levels off, scanning the sky for enemy fighters. The Luftwaffe is always nearby, waiting in clouds, ready to pounce. So far, the morning airspace is clear, but that can change in seconds. He thinks again of rituals, how every pilot invents their own. Some wear lucky socks. Some hum songs under their breath. Some, like James, touch a coin, whisper names, tap a compass, and control the breath. It's not about superstition. It's about rhythm, about creating order in the chaos of war. The sun climbs higher now, casting long shadows over the clouds. James's eyes burn slightly from the cold, but he doesn't blink much. Every second counts. The engine hum becomes background music, a steady presence that fills the silence between thoughts. He wonders briefly what it will be like after the war, if there is an after. Will he be able to sit in a room without scanning windows for threats? Will his body ever stop reacting to sudden noises? Will his hands ever stop remembering? The feel of these controls, the exact pressure needed on the throttle, the texture of leather against his palm. The radio crackles again, this time a routine check-in. All units, report status. James presses the button on his stick, his voice calm. Red 3, maintaining altitude. All systems normal. The words come out smoothly, no hint of the thoughts. Swirling beneath. That's part of the job. Keeping the outside calm while the inside churns quietly. The squadron maintains its pattern, each pilot locked in their rituals, their small worlds inside the bigger one. James adjusts his goggles, clears his throat softly, and checks his fuel gauge again, even though he knows it's fine. In through the nose, out through the mouth. The breath is the anchor. The sky can stretch you thin if you're not careful, can make you forget you have a body, can make you drift into a kind of trance. But breathing keeps you here, now, in this cockpit, in this moment. James looks down again at the countryside, at the rivers and fields and tiny roads. Somewhere down there, someone is baking bread, someone is feeding chickens, someone is holding their child close. He holds on to that thought for a moment, lets it fill the quiet space in his mind. It reminds him why he's up here, why he climbs into this machine day after day. Not for medals, not for glory, but for the chance, however slim, to protect something fragile and ordinary down below. The sky remains calm for now, but James knows better than to trust it. Calm skies are often the prelude to storms. His hands stay light on the controls, his breath steady, his mind cycling through the rituals that keep him grounded, even when there's no ground beneath him. This is the life of a pilot in World War II. Not just the dogfights and the danger, but the quiet moments in between, the hours spent scanning empty horizons, the mental chess game of staying alert without losing yourself. The Spitfire's engine hums beneath him. The world below slides silently past, and James Holloway remains suspended in the thin air between life and death, between fear and focus, between sky and memory. Sometimes the most dangerous part of flying isn't the dogfight or the anti-aircraft fire or the terrifying moment when an engine coughs mid-air and your stomach turns to ice. It's the waiting. The long stretches of sky where nothing happens except the soft hum of the engine and the slow turning of thoughts inside your head. Thoughts that build and echo because there's nothing to interrupt them. No conversation, no footsteps. Just the vast silence of the sky pressing against your ears. Lieutenant James Holloway knew this part well. The part where the mission hadn't started yet, but your mind already has, spinning through possibilities, calculating odds, replaying memories. His Spitfire continued to slice through the morning. Air, the horizon painted in shades of gray and silver as the sun tried to break through the clouds, casting thin shafts of light over the English countryside far below. From this height, the world looked peaceful, serene even. Tiny farms like squares on a quilt, rivers threading their way through mist-covered hills, church steeples poking up like markers from another century. But James knew better. He knew that somewhere beyond those hills were factories producing enemy aircraft, airfields sending up fighters, cities bracing for bombings. His squadron held formation, each pilot alone in his metal shell, gloved hands resting lightly on controls, eyes flicking back and forth, scanning the sky for shapes that didn't belong. He flexed his fingers inside his gloves, felt the stiffness in his joints from the cold. His oxygen mask hissed softly as he breathed in, out, the rhythm steady, a metronome to keep panic at bay. In his chest pocket, the silver coin shifted slightly with each subtle movement of the plane, a constant reminder of Emily's hands pressing it into his palm, her whisper still echoing in his mind. He had thought about her more than usual today. Maybe it was the way the morning light caught the frost on the plane's wings before takeoff, or the way his heart had thudded quietly, not in fear, but in some deeper place, some human part of him that the war hadn't burned away yet. James adjusted the trim again, making minor corrections to keep the plane level, his eyes scanning the clouds ahead. The sky can lull you into a trance if you let it. The gentle rocking of the aircraft, the drone of the engine, the sheer repetition of patrol flights. But somewhere in that trance lies danger, the moment when a pilot lets his guard down, when focus drifts for just a second too long, when the enemy appears like a ghost from the clouds, and you're a fraction of a second too slow to react. That's why pilots invented rituals, habits they repeated every flight, not because they believed in magic, but because they needed control over something, anything, in a world that offered so little of it. For James, it was the coin, the breathing, the glance at the compass every minute, the tap of his glove on the altimeter, the silent whisper of his sister's name, Claire, 11 years old, far from the war, writing letters to a brother she thought was at a desk job somewhere safe. James had written back, of course, though his mother would hide the letters. No need for Claire to know about bullet holes and wings, about watching friends spiral out of the sky in flames, about the nights when sleep wouldn't come because your mind replayed the sound of enemy fire again and again. The squadron's radio crackled softly in his ear, routine check-ins, voices calm, clipped, professional. Red leader, maintaining altitude, no contact. Lu 2, position stable. James listened, keeping his own eyes sharp, scanning the 3 o'clock and 9 o'clock positions, checking above and below. The sky was clear for now, but the Luftwaffe had a habit of appearing when least expected. Somewhere far ahead, the bombers would be approaching their targets. Heavy B-17s crawling through the air like lumbering giants, their gunners scanning the skies for enemy fighters. James thought of those men, locked inside freezing cabins, fingers stiff on triggers, eyes wide, knowing that death could come in seconds from a burst of cannon fire or a streak of tracer rounds slicing through the fuselage. His job was to keep them safe, to clear the air of threats before they arrived. It wasn't always possible, but that was the mission. Protect the bombers, protect the boys inside. He checked his fuel gauge again, though he'd checked it 10 times already. Habit, ritual, stay focused. His mind drifted briefly to last night, the quiet in the barracks, the way the other pilots had sat silently on their bunks, writing letters, cleaning gear, lost in their thoughts. Some of them whispered prayers. Some stared at the floor, eyes glazed, listening to the wind outside the window. James had cleaned his goggles for the third time, fingers moving in small circles, polishing until the glass was spotless. He remembered the feel of the cloth in his hands, the way his breath fogged the lens, a tiny ritual that helped keep his nerves steady. Up here, in the sky, those rituals were lifelines. Without them, the mind could unravel, could drift into thoughts of mortality, of what might happen if an enemy pilot got the drop on you, if your engine failed, if you had to bail out over the channel or behind enemy lines. James had heard stories of pilots captured, of freezing in rubber dinghies for hours before rescue, or worse, of drowning alone while the sea swallowed the sky. He shook the thought away, refocused on the present. Breath in, breath out. Compass. Check. Altimeter check. He glanced at his squadron mates, small dots in the sky now, each man holding his position with precision, learned through endless training. They were good, these boys, despite their youth. Some had barely finished school before enlisting. James himself had been studying engineering before the war swept him into the cockpit. Now his classroom was the sky, his lessons written in smoke, trails and engine sounds, and the quiet calculations of survival. The radio crackled again this time. A warning. Red leader. Possible contacts. 11 o'clock high. James's stomach tightened slightly, but his hands stayed calm on the controls. He banked the plane gently, scanning the sky where indicated. At first, he saw nothing but clouds, pale and soft against the morning light. Then, movement a shimmer. A flicker of motion where there shouldn't be. Enemy fighters? He squinted, adjusted his goggles. The shapes resolved into friendly aircraft P-51 Mustangs, their sleek profiles slicing through the sky as they took up escort positions around the bombers. Relief washed through him, but only briefly. The enemy was still out there somewhere. They always were. James leveled off, checked his instruments again. His breath fogged the inside of his mask for a moment before clearing. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows over the clouds, turning the sky into a silver-blue canvas stretched endlessly in all directions. Sometimes, in moments like this, it was easy to forget about the war, to feel for just a second like you were part of something larger than conflict, part of the air itself, moving silently above the world. But James knew better. He knew that beauty could be a trap, that wonder could get you killed. His instructor's words echoed again. Don't get romantic about the sky, boys. It'll turn on you when you least expect it. His eyes stayed sharp, scanning the horizon, his hands light on the stick. Below, the earth moved slowly, the rivers gleaming like silver threads, the villages tiny and still. Somewhere, farmers were starting their day. Somewhere, children were playing, unaware of the men flying far above them, locked in silent battles against enemies, both visible and invisible. James thought of Emily again, her voice in his ear last night, soft but insistent. Come back to me. He wanted to. God, how he wanted to. But wanting wasn't enough. Up here, survival wasn't guaranteed. It was borrowed time. Every second a gift, bought with fuel, with focus, with luck. He checked his compass, tapped it once a habit, a charm against the void. His breath remained steady, in through the nose, out through the mouth. The sky stretched out endlessly ahead, but James Holloway stayed in his small circle of control, hands steady, mind calm, rituals intact, waiting for whatever came next. The hardest part of flying missions wasn't always the combat. Sometimes it was the night before, lying awake in the cold barracks, staring at the ceiling while sleep refused to come, knowing that morning meant another flight into skies that could betray you in an instant. Lieutenant James Holloway had spent last night like that, eyes open long past midnight, listening to the soft breathing of the other pilots, the occasional rustle of blankets, the wind rattling the window panes as if whispering warnings no one wanted to hear. Some of the younger boys had fallen asleep fast, exhaustion pulling them under like a tide, but others lay frozen in that same quiet limbo James knew too well, caught between the need for rest and the fear of what rest would bring. Dreams of burning engines, of friends tumbling out of the sky, of parachutes failing to open. Sleep in wartime was a fragile thing, easily broken by the mind's shadows. James had rolled onto his side, pulling the blanket tighter, eyes tracing the cracks in the wall, illuminated by moonlight. His thoughts drifted to home, to the soft hum of the kitchen radio in his mother's house, to his father's chair by the fireplace, to Claire's laughter in the garden before the war. But the images felt distant now, like scenes from a film reel flickering at the edges of memory. War changes the weight of time. Months feel like years, and days blur together until the past becomes something you visit only in fragments, between missions, between meals, between the moments when your mind is too tired to resist. That night, James had taken the silver coin from his pocket, running it between his fingers under the blanket, feeling the cool metal press into his palm. Emily's coin. He had whispered her name into the dark room, lips barely moving, a sound meant for no one but himself. Emily, he'd said, the word dissolving into the silence, merging with the breaths of sleeping men around him. He'd wondered where she was at that exact moment. Was she sleeping too? Awake and worrying? Maybe sitting by her window, looking. At the same moon? The coin had become more than just a charm. It was a tether, a weight that kept him from floating too far into fear. In those quiet barracks, every pilot had his way of coping with the night. Some scribbled in journals, writing words they'd never show anyone. Others polished boots that were already clean, or folded letters from home again and again until the paper went soft at the creases. James had once found a fellow pilot tracing the same diagram of a Spitfire's engine over and over, pencil lines pressed deep into the paper, eyes vacant, but hands steady. It wasn't about learning. It was about distraction, about giving the mind something to hold on to when the future was too uncertain to face head on. When dawn finally came, it arrived quietly, a pale gray light slipping through the frost-laced windows, turning the airfield outside into a cold canvas of shadows and silhouettes. James had dressed in silence, layers of wool and leather, pulling, on gloves that felt colder than his skin, boots stiff from yesterday's mud. The ritual of dressing for flight was almost sacred. Flight jacket zipped just so, oxygen mask checked for cracks, goggles cleaned one last time. He'd slipped the coin into his pocket, where it belonged, close to his chest. Breakfast had been the same as always: thin porridge, lukewarm tea, the clatter of metal spoons against tin bowls. But few of the men had eaten much. Eating before a mission was like tempting fate. Full stomachs didn't sit well with nerves or with the jolts. of turbulence waiting in the sky. James had sipped his tea, eyes distant, listening to the murmur of briefing orders echoing from the next room. Targets, routes, enemy sightings from the day before. Words flowed over him like water, important but also mechanical, part of the daily pattern of war. He'd memorized the route, noted the checkpoints, but part of him knew that once in the sky, the map would fade, replaced by instinct, by reaction, by the immediacy of staying alive. After breakfast came the walk to the plane, boots crunching. Over frost, breath hanging in the air like smoke. Mechanics stood by the aircraft, checking fuel lines, tightening bolts, faces drawn and pale in the cold. In the cold. Tommy had been there, as always, wiping his hands on a rag, giving James a nod that said more than words ever could. No goodbyes, no good luck. Just the nod, the unspoken understanding between the men who stayed on the ground and the ones who disappeared into the clouds. Climbing into the cockpit had been muscle memory by now left foot on the wing strut, right hand gripping the edge, body folding into the cramped space as naturally as slipping into bed. The seat had been cold, the controls familiar, throttle, stick, compass, altimeter, instruments checked and rechecked, each glance part of the ritual that kept the panic at bay. James had touched the coin in his pocket once, whispered Emily's name, then Claire's. His hands had steadied on the stick. The engine had roared to life beneath him, vibrating through the frame of the plane, through his bones, through his breath. Taxiing to the runway, he'd felt the shift the moment when the earth started to fall away, when the plane became not just a machine, but an extension of his own body. The air had welcomed him with its usual cold embrace, a familiar, white against his cheeks where the oxygen mask didn't cover. As the Spitfire had climbed, the world below had shrunk, farms turning into tiny squares, rivers into silver threads, roads into pale lines barely visible through the mist. In the cockpit, James had settled into the rhythm of flight. That strange combination of focus and distance, of being fully present and yet somewhere else at the same time. His hands had moved automatically, adjusting trim, checking instruments, scanning the sky. The squadron had taken formation, V-shaped against the clouds, each pilot alone, but connected by invisible threads of duty, of routine, of shared risk. The radio had crackled softly in his ear, voices calm, reporting positions. Red 3, maintaining altitude. Blue 2, visual contact with bomber group. Routine words, spoken in tones designed to hide the fear beneath. Hours in the sky had a way of stretching time, making minutes feel like hours, making thoughts loop back on themselves. James had counted his breaths, kept his mind steady. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Oxygen hissed softly in his mask. His gloves tapped the compass once, then twice. A coin in his pocket shifted with each bank in turn. Below, the earth continued its silent roll, indifferent to the war above. Somewhere down there, people lived their lives baker setting. Dough, children chasing each other in schoolyards, mothers hanging laundry in backyards that looked like tiny squares from this height. James held on to those images, let them anchor him. That's why they flew, after all, not for medals, not for glory, but to protect those small, ordinary moments from being swallowed by darkness. The sun had risen higher, casting long shadows across the clouds. Enemy fighters had not appeared yet, but the threat of them lingered in every pilot's mind. James had scanned the horizon, eyes sharp behind his goggles, looking for shapes that didn't belong, for flashes of movement that might signal danger. His breath had remained steady, his thoughts circling the same patterns. Emily's coin, Claire's smile, the soft creak of leather gloves against the stick. In those hours before contact, the mind became a strange landscape, part memory, part Anticipation, part fear, wrapped in routine. The cold seeped through every layer of clothing, numbing fingers, stiffening joints. But James had learned to live with it, to let it become part of the background hum, like the engine, like the radio, static like the steady beat of his own heart. Waiting in the sky was like balancing on a wire stretched between life and death, knowing that at any moment the stillness could shatter into chaos. But for now, the sky had remained calm, the squadron steady, the mission still in its early hours. James had glanced at his fuel gauge, tapped it once, a habit, a reassurance. He'd looked at the compass, checked his heading. He'd adjusted the throttle slightly, listened to the engine respond. All of it is art of the ritual, part of staying alive. Above him, the sky stretched endlessly, pale blue fading to silver. Near the horizon, below, the ground slid silently by, a world distant and yet still home. His breath had fogged the inside of his mask briefly before clearing. The coin had pressed against his chest, warm now from his body heat. The memory of Emily's voice had lingered in his ears, soft and fragile. "Come back to me." James had whispered it back, a promise to no one but himself, a vow made silently in the cockpit, as the Spitfire carried him further into the days. Mission, into the waiting sky, into whatever came next. There's a moment in the life of a pilot when the machine becomes an extension of the body, when the vibration of the engine hums in the bones, when the pressure of the oxygen mask against the face feels like part of your own skin, and the thin leather of your gloves turns into second flesh, gripping the controls not out of conscious thought, but out of a muscle memory, so deep it becomes instinct. And that's where Lieutenant James Holloway found himself now, halfway into his mission, eyes sharp behind fog-resistant goggles, his breath slow and steady as the Spitfire cut through the upper layers of cold morning air. The sky stretched out in pale ribbons of cloud, silver light bleeding across the horizon, while below him the patchwork earth rotated silently, far too peaceful for the reality of war. But up here, in the cockpit, it wasn't about the beauty of the landscape. It was about survival, about control, about managing every single detail from fuel to flaps to the quiet, creeping thoughts that threatened to intrude during long flights, the kind of thoughts that could get a man killed if they weren't kept in check. Because the mind has a way of wandering when the sky is quiet, when the enemy hasn't appeared yet, when you're flying patterns you've flown a dozen times before. And James knew that if he let himself drift too far into memory or fear, he might miss the glint of sun off an enemy fuselage, might miss the moment when the sky shifted from calm to chaos. And so he kept his rituals close. Breath in, check the compass, breath out, adjust the trim, glance at the fuel gauge, tap the altimeter, whisper a name under his breath, not because he believed in magic, but because structure keeps panic at bay, and in war, the smallest routines can save your life. So James whispered Emily's name now, lips barely moving beneath the rubber seal of his mask, and thought for a moment of her, standing by the airfield fence the night before, her scarf fluttering in the wind, her eyes locked onto his, as if trying to memorize his face before he disappeared into the sky again. And then he thought of Claire, his little sister, who still believed he was stationed safely somewhere behind the lines, who sent him drawings of airplanes with cheerful notes like "Fly safe, Jimmy," written in her careful, looping handwriting, letters that his mother never gave her back, letters that sat in a drawer waiting for a war to end. But James had read them all, kept them folded in his locker, unfolded them quietly in the late hours, when the barracks were still, when the only sound was the soft breathing of other pilots, dreaming uneasy dreams. And now he carried those memories into the cockpit with him, because they were part of the ritual too, part of the invisible armor. It helped keep the fear manageable, because fear wasn't something you erased. It was something you learned to fold neatly into your uniform, to carry with you like a map or a flight plan. And today, As the Spitfire soared steadily over the countryside, his eyes darted between the instrument panel and the vast sky beyond, scanning for threats, for flashes of silver that meant enemy fighters, for black bursts of flak that signaled anti-aircraft batteries far below. But for now, the sky remained calm. The radio in his ear, carrying only soft static and the occasional position check from other pilots. Voices clipped and professional. The kind of voices that don't betray the tension coiled in every muscle. Because every man in this squadron knew what could happen in the next 5 minutes, and yet they flew anyway. Because that's what you did. You climbed into the cockpit, you fastened the harness, you checked the guns, and you launched yourself into the thin air, knowing full well that you might not come back, but you did it. Because the job wasn't about comfort or safety. It was about protecting something fragile and ordinary. Something as simple as a mother hanging laundry or a baker kneading dough. And so James stayed focused, his gloved hand tapping the compass again, eyes flicking left and right, scanning the edges of his vision where enemy fighters sometimes appeared, like ghosts, like sudden shadows in a clear sky. And he remembered the briefing that morning. The way the commanding officer had pointed to the maps spread out over the wooden table, tracing lines with a stick, marking enemy airfields, explaining the mission profile. Protect the bombers, intercept any threats, stay sharp, stay alive. And James had memorized it all, had nodded along with the rest, but he knew that plans meant very little once you were in the air, because the sky has its own rules, and war has a way of twisting the script, so you had to be ready for anything. Had to keep your breathing slow, your mind clear, your hands steady, even when your heart tried to race ahead of you. And now as he flew, he thought of the mechanics back on the ground, of Tommy tightening bolts, checking fuel lines, giving the usual nod instead of saying goodbye, because goodbyes were considered bad luck, and James respected that superstition. Because in this war, sometimes superstition was all you had. So he flew with the coin Emily had given him tucked in his pocket, pressed close to his chest like a second dog tag, like a silent prayer, and he flew with her voice in his ears, soft and steady, saying, "Come back to me," the same way she had the night before, the same way she always did, and he carried that into the cockpit, letting it anchor him as he banked left, adjusting the rudder slightly, keeping formation, watching his squadron mates through the edges of his vision, small shadows moving in precise lines, each man following the same rituals, the same silent promises whispered into oxygen masks. And somewhere in the back of his mind, James thought about the machine beneath him, about the way the Spitfire responded to his touch, how the controls felt like extensions of his own limbs now, how the vibrations of the engine blended into the rhythm of his breath. And he remembered his instructor's words from training. "You don't fly the plane. Son, you become the plane." And it was true, because up here, at altitude, there's no room for separation between man and machine, between thought and action, between fear and focus. And James knew that every second he stayed in that state was a second closer to surviving the mission, to bringing his squadron back home, to writing another letter to Claire, to holding Emily's hand again under the dim lights of the airfield. So he kept his eyes sharp, his body relaxed but ready, his mind in that delicate balance between alertness and calm, and he thought of the bomber crews far ahead, the heavy B-17s moving slowly toward their targets, men inside shivering in freezing gunner positions, watching the sky for enemy fighters, counting seconds, and he knew his job was to clear the path for them, to keep the air safe, and he would do that job with everything he had. Because failure meant more than just death. It meant letting down the people who trusted him, who needed him to come back. And so he stayed in the moment, hands light on the stick, eyes scanning the clouds, breath steady, rituals intact, waiting for the sky to change, for the radio to crackle with urgency, for the enemy to appear. But until then, he flew, he breved, He remembered why he was here. And he whispered Emily's name again as the Spitfire carried him forward into the waiting day. There is a peculiar silence that fills the cockpit after hours in the sky. A kind of heavy, humming stillness that wraps itself around your ears. Not because the engine is quiet, it never is, but because your mind starts to filter out the sound, absorbing it until the vibrations of the machine become part of your bloodstream, part of your breathing, part of your very existence. And Lieutenant James Holloway had long since reached that state, flying now as though the Spitfire were not a separate object, but a metal extension of his own body, his hands moving without thought, adjusting throttle, checking gauges, eyes flicking between the sky and the instruments in a rhythm so ingrained it no longer required conscious effort. Just like walking, just like breathing. And yet underneath that smooth surface, there was always a current of readiness, a quiet edge of awareness that kept him alive, because in war, the sky can shift from peace to chaos in the blink of an eye. And James knew that too well to let his guard down now, even as the sun reached its highest point, and the countryside below glowed softly beneath a thin layer of mist, rivers curling through fields like veins, tiny roads crossing in forgotten patterns, and somewhere down there, people lived their lives in houses that looked like dollhouses from this height. And yet up here, at 20,000 feet, the reality was different. The air colder, thinner, and the space between life and death measured not in hours, but in seconds. In the twitch of a control stick, in the glance of an eye, in the decision to bank left instead of right. And James kept his senses tuned to the quiet signals that meant danger, the subtle flicker in the periphery, the unnatural movement in the clouds, the change in tone over the radio that might mean enemy fighters approaching. But for now, the sky held steady, the squadron in formation, each Spitfire a shadow against the pale blue. And James thought about the fuel gauge again, about the limits of his machine, about the balance between speed and conservation, between staying ready to fight and making sure he had enough petrol to get home. Because in these missions, running out of fuel could be just as fatal as enemy bullets. And he tapped the gauge. Once, a habit now, part of the ritual that kept him focused. Just like the silver coin pressing against his chest inside his flight jacket. Emily's coin, the one she'd slipped into his hand the night before his first combat flight, her eyes glassy but her voice steady. "Come back to me," she'd said, and those words looped in his mind sometimes, especially during the quiet stretches when the sky held no threat, when the worst enemy was the creeping drift of the mind into places it shouldn't go, into the what-ifs, into the memories. Of the boys who hadn't come back, their bunks empty now in the barracks, their cups untouched at the breakfast table. And James kept those thoughts at bay with ritual, with rhythm, with the repetition of scanning the horizon, of breathing slow, of touching the compass lightly, with his gloved fingers, because distraction was the enemy, just as surely as a Messerschmitt or a Focke-Wulf. And as he flew, he remembered the lecture from training, the instructor pacing at the front of the hangar, boots echoing on the concrete floor. "Gentlemen, you must become part of the aircraft, not just a man flying it, but part of it, fused to it, because that's the only way to survive at altitude, to live through the split-second decisions that air combat demands." And James had taken that to heart, had let the cockpit become his world, had memorized the way the Spitfire responded to every touch, the way the engine sounded when it was running smooth, and the way it coughed when it was starved of fuel, the way the wings sliced through turbulence, the slight tremor in the stick when the flaps caught a gust of crosswind. And now, in this long moment of calm, he let his body relax, but his mind stay sharp, eyes moving in small arcs across the sky, checking left, checking right, scanning above and below, looking for shapes that didn't belong, for flashes of light that meant enemy, canopies catching the sun, for movement that wasn't cloud. And he thought about the bombers far ahead, The B-17s and Lancasters lumbering toward their targets. Men inside sweating in heavy jackets. Hands cold on gun triggers. Their lives depending on fighters like James to clear the skies of threats. And he felt the weight of that responsibility, not as a burden, but as a reason. A purpose. Because flying wasn't just about the adrenaline of dogfights. It was about protecting the boys in those bombers. About keeping the sky safe for them to do their part. And James had seen enough burning wreckage to know how fragile that safety was, had smelled the smoke of crash sites, had heard the pop of ammunition cooking off in flames, and he carried those images with him as warnings, as reminders to stay alert, to never let the beauty of the sky distract from the danger it held. And yet sometimes, despite everything, he couldn't help but notice the way the clouds layered over each other like folds of silk, the way the sun caught the edge of a wingtip and made it shine like glass, the way the earth looked so distant, so soft from up here. And in those moments, he wondered what it would be like to fly without war, just for the love of flight, just for the joy of moving through air like a bird. But that wasn't the world he lived in, not now, and so he pulled his thoughts back, checked his instruments again, listened to the steady thrum of the Merlin engine, felt the familiar tremble of power beneath him. And he thought about fuel lines, about coolant pressure, about the little things that could go wrong, because machines had no loyalty, no mercy, and he respected that, respected the fact that his life depended on metal and oil and human maintenance. Back on the ground, on Tommy and the other mechanics who worked through the night to keep these planes running, their hands chapped, their eyes red, and he thought about the quiet nod Tommy had given him before takeoff. No words, just the nod, because in this world, words were too heavy sometimes. And James carried that nod with him now, like another piece of armor, like another charm, and as he banked slightly to adjust for wind drift, he glanced at the squadron. Spread out around him, each plane holding its place in the sky, each pilot locked in his own cockpit, in his own mind, breathing his own ritual breaths, and he wondered what they were thinking, if they were counting minutes until fuel forced them to turn back, if they were whispering names of loved ones, if they were rehearsing maneuvers in their heads, picturing the split-second rolls and dives they'd need if enemy fighters appeared from behind a cloud. And James kept his breathing steady, in through the nose, out through the mouth, oxygen hissing softly, and he checked his ammunition count again, even though he knew it by heart, even though he hadn't fired a shot today yet. And he wondered if that was about to change, because the radio crackled in his ear with a voice he recognized, calm but urgent, red leader, possible contacts at 11 o'clock high. And James felt the familiar tightening in his chest. Not fear exactly, but a coiling of focus, of readiness. And he scanned the sky in the direction called out, his eyes slicing through the glare, looking for the flicker of movement that would confirm the report. And there, in the distance, a speck, then two, then four, growing larger, resolving into the shapes of aircraft, too far away yet to identify. And his training kicked in, his mind flipping through silhouettes stored in memory, the distinct profiles of friendly and enemy planes, the telltale wing shapes, the engine configurations, and he adjusted his position, prepared to call out the sighting, his thumb brushing the radio switch on his stick, but waiting until he was sure, because premature calls could cause chaos in formation. And then the shapes grew clearer. Mustangs, P-51s, American escorts joining the route, and he exhaled slowly, tension easing but only slightly, because the sky was still vast, the enemy still out there somewhere, and this was just one small part of the endless ballet of aircraft crossing these cold altitudes. And James kept flying, kept scanning, kept breathing, his mind balanced between calm and readiness, between memory and mission, between the cold steel of his machine and the warm pulse of his own humanity, knowing that this was the life of a pilot in World War II. Not just the dogfights, but the waiting, the scanning, the managing of machines and minds in equal measure. And as the Spitfire carried him forward, wings steady, heart steady, he whispered Emily's name again, just once, letting it mix with the hum of the engine, letting it drift into the sky where all his thoughts eventually went. There are parts of a pilot's day that don't get written into the history books, parts that no movie can properly capture. The quiet in-between moments, when the sky stretches out like an empty canvas and the mind drifts not toward heroism but toward the simple routines of survival. And for Lieutenant James Holloway, this was one of those moments, a long quiet stretch. A flight where his Spitfire cruised through thin cold air, the squadron maintaining formation. No enemies in sight yet, but every nerve tuned to the possibility that they might appear at any second. Because that's how it worked out here. You could be staring at nothing but clouds for hours, and then suddenly find yourself in the middle of a dogfight, engines roaring, bullets snapping past your canopy. And the transition from calm to chaos was never gradual. It was instant, like the sky flipping a switch. But for now, James stayed in the rhythm of flight, his hands resting lightly on the stick, his feet nudging the rudder pedals now and then to correct for drift, his eyes scanning the space ahead, to the left, to the right, above and below, because danger came from all angles in air combat, and you had to be ready, always ready, even when your body started to relax, even when the repetitive hum of the Merlin engine tried to lull you into a false sense of safety. And James had learned long ago to trust the routines more than his feelings, because the body could get lazy, but the rituals wouldn't. So he kept his breathing slow, checked the compass again, capped the fuel gauge with a gloved knuckle, touched the coin in his pocket just once. A brief acknowledgement of Emily's silent promise wrapped around his heart like a ribbon. Then back to scanning the sky, back to the endless search for enemy silhouettes, for that flash of light that meant a canopy catching the sun, for the black specks on the horizon that could mean incoming fighters. And as he flew, his mind flicked through the mechanics of flight the way a pianist runs scales. Not out of anxiety, but out of habit, running his thumb along the throttle grip, feeling the vibration of the engine through the seat of his pants, listening for any change in pitch or rhythm, because engines had their own language, and pilots learned to speak it whether they wanted to or not. And so far, the Merlin purred steady, the oil pressure needle right where it should be, coolant temperature holding steady, despite the high-altitude cold. And James let part of his mind drift into the checklist, into the mechanical side of flying, because it was safer there than in memory. Safer to think about RPMs and manifold pressure than to think about the faces of friends lost over France, the empty bunks back at base, the letters left in lockers that no one would ever read. And yet, despite his best efforts, his mind wandered anyway, because you can't lock down memory forever, not when you're alone in a cockpit for hours at a time. And so he found himself thinking of Andy Mercer, his bunkmate from training, the one who'd always hum a tune before takeoff, who used to tie a red string around his wrist for luck, who used to joke about how the sky was probably full of angels arguing over who got to watch the dogfights. And James remembered how Andy had disappeared from formation one morning, just like this one, just gone, no radio call, no warning, just a puff of smoke from a sudden hit, a streak of flames spiraling toward the ground, and afterward there had been no wreckage to recover, just an empty chair in the mess hall, a flight suit folded and sent back home. And James carried that memory with him the same way he carried the coin, not out of morbid attachment, but because it was part of the job, part of the air itself now. And as he flew, he wondered how many other pilots were thinking the same thing in their cockpits right now, wondering who'd be missing at breakfast tomorrow, who'd leave behind a locker full of letters and photographs. But these thoughts, though heavy, were also normal, expected, part of the ritual of wartime flying, part of the way you kept yourself sane by letting the thoughts come and then pushing them aside again, refocusing on the here and now, on the altitude needle, on the heading, on the steady growl of the propeller slicing the air. And James thought about the mechanics back on the ground again, about Tommy with his grease-stained hands and the way he always checked the fuel lines twice, the way he'd given James that quiet nod this morning. No words exchanged, just a nod. Because words could be dangerous before a flight. Words could stick in your mind at the wrong moment. So the men kept their goodbyes locked inside. Let their hands do the talking. Hands. Tightening harness straps. Hands wiping fog from goggles. Hands tapping shoulders as pilots climbed into their planes. And James thought of those hands now, the ones that kept his Spitfire flying, that made sure every bolt was tight, every hose connected, and he silently thanked them as he adjusted the mixture control, leaned the engine slightly for better fuel economy at this altitude, and glanced at his squadron, the V formation holding steady, small specks against the vast backdrop of sky, each pilot trapped in his own small world of metal and glass, each one breathing his own oxygen, thinking his own thoughts. And James knew that despite their training, despite the radios that linked them, each of them was ultimately alone up here, alone with the sky, alone with their memories. And yet they were connected too, by duty, by trust, by the knowledge that if one of them called out an enemy sighting, the rest would move without hesitation, bank into action, guns hot, because that's what they did. They protected each other as best they could, even knowing the odds. And as James scanned the sky again, his eyes sharp behind the goggles, he saw nothing yet, just clouds forming lazy shapes, just the earth below sliding past like a map. And he thought about the ground crews who never saw this view, who stayed in the mud and oil of the airfields, their work invisible to history but vital, and he carried their effort with him too. Because flying wasn't just about skill, it was about teamwork, about every wrench turned at 2 in the morning, every rivet checked, every fuel tank topped off with freezing hands. And as the minutes passed, James let his breath slow again, oxygen hissing softly, his hands light on the controls, his mind a mixture of readiness and memory. And he thought about what would happen if he had to bail out today, if the enemy showed up in force and he had to jump. The parachute drill running through his mind, automatically pull the harness, check the canopy, control the swing, prepare for landing. But he also knew the risks, knew that bailing out over enemy territory could mean capture, could mean months. In a prison camp, if you were lucky, could mean worse if you weren't. And yet those thoughts didn't scare him as much as they used to, because by now, death had become an idea he carried with him like a coin in his pocket, like a photograph, tucked into a glove, not welcome, but not unfamiliar, just part of the landscape of flying, part of the calculation. And as he banked gently to adjust for formation spacing, he glanced at his fuel gauge again, calculated his return time in his head, checked the compass, touched the coin in his pocket without thinking, and whispered Emily's name softly. Thread of sound lost beneath the hum of the engine, and in that moment he realized that flying was as much about the mind as it was about the machine, about keeping your thoughts in line, about staying in the present, about remembering why you were up here in the first place, not for glory, not for medals, but to protect something fragile below, something worth all this risk, the quiet lives of people who baked bread, who read bedtime stories, who walked to market without looking up at the sky. And as James leveled out again, his eyes catching the glint of sun on his wingtip, he felt the balance return, the calm focus that let him keep flying, that let him stay alive. And he whispered a second name this time, his sister's Claire, and let it ride the wind, let it dissolve into the cold air as the Spitfire carried him further into the mission, further into the sky's endless quiet. Every pilot in World War II learned quickly that no matter how calm the sky seemed, it could betray you in an instant, turning from a place of soft clouds and sunlight into a battleground where metal shredded air, where engines roared louder than thoughts. where life and death unfolded, not in minutes, but in fractions of seconds. And Lieutenant James Holloway had lived through enough missions by now to know that this truth wasn't just something taught in briefings. It was something carved into his bones, into the very fabric of his breathing, which stayed slow and measured now, even as the first sign of trouble appeared on the horizon. A dark speck just at the edge of vision, a blur of movement too fast, too sharp to be a bird, too purposeful to be a drifting cloud shadow. And in the instant he saw it, his mind snapped into the kind of alertness that training could never fully prepare you for, the kind of focus that came only from experience, from having survived the moments when that speck turned into an enemy aircraft diving at you with guns. Hot. And so James didn't panic, didn't tense up. He simply shifted his grip on the stick, adjusted his throttle just slightly, kept his eyes locked on the moving shape, calling out into his radio with a voice calm and clipped. Red 3, contact at 2 o'clock high, unknown number. And even as he spoke the words, the adrenaline began to hum beneath his skin, not in a jittery way, but in the way a pilot's body learns to handle after too many missions, like flipping. A switch from routine flight to combat mode. Heart rate steady, but senses sharp. Breath still slow, because panic is the real killer in dogfights. And as the squadron responded, shifting formation, eyes turning toward the contact, James felt the cold clarity of battle settle over him like a second uniform, his mind narrowing. Its focus to the simple, primal tasks of survival: see the enemy, anticipate their move, stay alive, and now the speck resolved into shapes. 3 of them, no 5, moving fast, streaking toward the squadron from high altitude. And James recognized the wing shapes. The silhouettes burned into his memory from hundreds of hours staring at identification charts. Focke-Wulf 190s. Sleek, brutal machines, faster in a dive than his Spitfire, heavier guns, but less maneuverable if he could get them into a turning fight. And he didn't think about the statistics, didn't let the fear in, just adjusted his position, called. Out again. Bandits confirmed. 5 Focke-Wulfs, approaching fast, prepare to engage. And then the sky exploded, not with sound exactly, but with motion. The sudden sharp movements of aircraft banking, diving, the squadron breaking formation to respond, the calm routine of patrol dissolving into the chaos of combat. And James pulled his Spitfire into a climbing turn, knowing the Focke-Wulfs would try to dive through the formation. Take shots, then climb away. Typical boom and zoom tactics. But if he could catch one in a turn, he might have a chance. And his eyes locked onto one of the German planes streaking past, cannon shells flashing from its nose, tracer rounds cutting. The air in orange streaks, and James banked hard left, his body pressing into the seat, with G-forces that tightened his chest. But he kept breathing, kept his movements smooth, and the world tilted as he rolled the Spitfire over, the sky spinning into a blur for a moment before settling back into focus. And now he was behind one of the Focke-Wulfs, close enough to see the markings on its tail, close enough to see the pilot's helmet in the enemy cockpit. And he pressed. The trigger on his stick, felt the vibration as his .303 Brownings fired, the barrels rattling out short bursts of controlled fire, because wasting ammunition in panic was a rookie mistake. And James had learned to squeeze the trigger just long enough, just accurate enough, to get rounds on target without blowing through. His entire ammo load in seconds, and he saw sparks flash along the enemy's fuselage, metal peeling back, smoke curling from the engine cowling. But the Focke-Wulf dove away, trailing dark smoke, disappearing into cloud cover. And James didn't. Follow he knew better than to chase a damaged enemy into unknown sky. Knew that the rest of the fight was still happening around him. So he pulled back into his formation's defensive circle, eyes scanning for the next threat, heart steady, breath steady, because one enemy down didn't mean the fight was over. Not by a long shot. And now another Focke-Wulf dove in from above, guns blazing, and James rolled left again, pulling into a climbing spiral to bleed off the enemy's energy. Knowing that if he could stay inside the German pilot's turn, he'd have the advantage, and his mind calculated angles automatically, part training, part instinct now, because combat flying wasn't about thinking, it was about reacting faster than your opponent, moving like you were part of the machine. And the Spitfire responded beautifully, wings slicing the air, engine roaring but smooth. The Merlin engine singing the song that James had come to trust more than his own heartbeat. And he pulled the nose up, felt the shudder of the stall warning, but held it just at the edge, rolling out of the climb at the last second. And now he was behind the German fighter, close again, tracers reaching out. And he fired another burst, saw pieces of the enemy plane break off, saw the canopy explode outward as the pilot bailed. Out, parachute opening far below, and for a split second James wondered about that man, wondered who he was, where he'd come from, whether he'd make it to the ground alive. But he pushed the thought away, because there was no time for it. Not now, not in the middle of a fight where any hesitation could mean death. And as he leveled out again, scanning for more threats, he saw one of his own squadron spiraling downward, smoke trailing from the wing, and his stomach clenched, but he kept his focus, knew he couldn't help, couldn't follow, had to stay in. The fight, had to trust the pilot would get out, pull his chute, survive the landing, and James locked eyes onto another Focke-Wulf, this one pulling up into a climb, trying to escape, and he followed briefly, lining up a shot, but letting it go, conserving ammo, because his rounds were low now, and he knew better than to waste them when the fight might still turn again. So, he checked his surroundings, rolled into another defensive turn, kept scanning, kept breathing, because combat was about cycles engage, assess, disengage, re-engage, and the worst thing you could do was fixate on a single enemy while another lined you up from behind. And James had learned that lesson early, had seen friends shot down because they chased one kill too long, forgot to check 6 o'clock, and so he kept his head on a swivel now, eyes moving constantly, neck sore but functional. The habit of survival burned into his muscles, and as the fight continued, minutes felt like hours, the sky a blur of motion, the roar of engines blending into the rhythm of gunfire. And then, slowly, the combat began to break apart. The Focke-Wulfs disengaging, climbing away, their fuel running low or their orders shifting. And James exhaled slowly, felt the adrenaline drain, but kept his hands steady, kept his breathing even, because it wasn't over until the last enemy was gone. And he circled once more, checked. The sky saw only his squadron mates now, scattered but alive, some of them calling out over the radio, confirming kills, checking for survivors, and James added his voice to the mix, reporting his position, reporting his ammo status low but manageable, and then he turned his eyes back to the empty sky. The clouds now calm again, the earth below still spinning, as if none of it had happened. But James knew better, knew the fight would replay in his mind later, in dreams maybe, in the quiet hours before sleep, but for now he focused on regrouping, on counting his squadron's planes, on scanning for stragglers, and he whispered Emily's name once more, just softly, a tether to the world below, to the life he hoped to return to when this day was finally done. The aftermath of a dogfight is its own kind of silence, not the peaceful kind that drifts over an empty field at dusk, or the hush of a quiet barracks after lights out, but a deeper, stranger silence that seeps into your bones while your heart is still racing, while your hands still tremble faintly on the controls. And Lieutenant James Holloway found himself in that hollow quiet now, scanning the sky after the last Focke-Wulf had vanished into the clouds, his ears ringing not just from the roar of the Merlin engine, but from the lingering echoes of gunfire, from the memory of tracer rounds stitching the sky, from the images still sharp behind his eyes of wings tearing off. of parachutes blooming like ghostly flowers in the distance, of smoke trailing from engines as planes spiraled down to the indifferent earth below. And in this strange moment after combat, time seemed to bend, the seconds stretching long, the minutes looping in circles as James checked his instruments again, oil pressure steady, coolant temperature just below the danger line. Fuel lower than he liked, but still enough to get home if the wind didn't shift against him. And he whispered the same quiet prayers into his oxygen mask, not because he was religious in the traditional sense, but because rituals mattered now, more than ever, because after you fired your guns, after you saw death so close, it fogged the edges of your vision. You needed something to hold on to, something to anchor you back to the cockpit, back to the world where the machine still obeyed. You, where your breath still made clouds inside the mask, where your gloves still touched the controls like you were stroking the feathers of a bird. Gentle but ready to grip hard if turbulence came, and James adjusted his course now, banking slightly left, pulling the Spitfire back into formation with the remnants of his squadron, counting the aircraft in the sky, heart sinking a little when he realized one was missing. And his throat tightened, but he said nothing over the radio, because they all knew who it was, because they'd seen the smoke, the spiral, the way the plane had disappeared below the clouds, and no one spoke the name yet, because naming it made it real, made the empty chair at the mess hall unavoidable. And so they flew in silence for a few moments, each man alone in his thoughts, each man carrying the weight of the one who hadn't come back. And James touched the coin in his pocket, again, pressing it gently against his chest, feeling the cool edge bite into his glove, through the fabric of his flight jacket. Emily's coin, her whispered, "Come back to me," still looping in his mind, like background music beneath the steady drone of the engine. And he let that memory ride alongside the others, the smell of hot oil in the barracks, the sound of dice rolling across a wooden table during downtime, the scratch of a pencil writing another letter that might never be sent. And he realized, not for the first time, that war wasn't made up of the big moments, the headlines, the victory parades, but of these in-between spaces, the stretches of sky after the fight, the moments when you were still alive, but not untouched, when you flew with ghosts beside you, quiet passengers in the cockpit, their faces flickering in your peripheral vision, not haunting exactly, but reminding, always reminding. And James knew he'd carry those faces with him for the rest of his life, however long that would be, because flying wasn't just about surviving the mission, it was about surviving the memories afterward. And now the radio crackled softly in his ear, Red Leader's voice breaking the quiet with a clipped calmness. Squadron regroup, return to base, fuel check, and James pressed. His mic button reported his status. Voice steady, even though his hand still felt the tremble in his fingertips, the leftover adrenaline weaving its way through his bloodstream like electricity. And he eased the throttle back slightly, setting his course for home, the airfield. Somewhere behind him now, a place that seemed impossibly distant, even though it was only a few minutes away, because coming back from a mission never felt like a simple return. It felt like crossing a border between worlds, from sky to ground, from life balanced on the edge to life pretending at normalcy. And as the Spitfires banked together, engines humming in low harmony, James let his eyes drift to the horizon, to the pale line where the clouds kissed the earth. And he thought about the mechanics waiting back at base, about Tommy wiping his hands on an oil-stained rag, looking up at the sky, counting the planes. As they came in, his heart probably sinking a little when he saw there was one fewer than there should have been. And James wondered who would clean out the missing pilot's locker tonight, who would fold his uniform, who would write the letter home. And he hated that part of it, hated the way war turned people into tasks, into lists, into paperwork. But he understood it too, because that was how you kept going, how you kept flying, by compartmentalizing, by setting aside the grief long enough to finish the mission, to land the plane, to step out of the cockpit and smile at the ground crew even, when your stomach twisted in knots. And now James adjusted his altitude, dropping slightly as the airfield came into view, the familiar layout of runways and hangars, like a safe harbor after stormy seas. But he kept his focus sharp, because landing was always dangerous, always. The place where mistakes could happen if you let your mind drift. And so he checked his instruments again, did the landing checklist in his head, undercarriage down, flap set, speed just right, and as the wheels touched the tarmac with a gentle bump, he felt the plane settle back into the Earth's gravity, the engine still humming beneath him, the vibrations moving from wings to wheels to ground, and he taxied to his parking spot, the ground crew waving him in, their faces tired but relieved to see him. And as he cut the engine, the sudden stillness pressed against his ears, the absence of noise louder than any sound, and he sat there for a moment, hands on his lap, breath slowing, feeling the sweat cool against his back, despite the cold outside, feeling the ache in his neck from hours of keeping his head on a swivel. And finally, he unbuckled his harness, slid the canopy back, let the cold air hit his face full force, and it felt like a slap, like a wake-up call back to reality, and he climbed out of the cockpit, boots hitting the ground with a dull thud, legs shaky but functional, and Tommy was there, ready to catch him if he stumbled. But James waved him off with a small smile, pretending everything was fine, because that was part of the job too, pretending, keeping the cracks hidden, at least until you were alone in your bunk again. And as the other planes landed one by one, the squadron gathered near the hangar, silent nods exchanged, eyes scanning for the missing plane one last time, even though they all knew it wasn't coming back. And then the debrief started, the reports, the maps, the confirmations of enemy kills and the tally of losses. And James stood there, helmet in hand, listening but not really hearing, his mind still in the sky, still replaying the moments of the dogfight, the flashes of light, the smell of cordite, the feel of the stick in his hand as he squeezed the trigger, and later, much later, after the reports were filed, after the mechanics rolled the damaged planes into the hangar for repairs, after the sun began to dip toward the horizon, James sat alone on a wooden crate near the edge of the airfield, staring at the sky that had gone back to looking peaceful. Again, the kind of sky that made civilians think of poetry or romance, not of war, and he reached into his pocket, pulled out Emily's coin, turned it over and over between his fingers, the metal warm now from his body heat, and he thought about writing her another letter tonight, maybe leaving out the part about the missing pilot, maybe just telling her he was safe, that he'd flown another mission, that he'd seen the clouds from above again. And maybe someday, when the war was over, he'd find a way to explain the rest, the parts no one put into letters, the parts you carried in silence. Alone with the cold sky, there's something about the hours after a mission that feels heavier than the mission itself. A kind of weight that settles into the muscles, not just from physical exhaustion, but from the invisible strain of surviving. Again, of walking back through the doors of the barracks, knowing that someone else's bed would be empty tonight. And Lieutenant James Holloway felt that weight now, deep in his shoulders, in the back of his neck, as he sat at the edge of his bunk, flight jacket unzipped, hands resting loosely between his knees, staring at the scuffed wooden floor, while the others moved quietly around him. No one speaking too loud, no one laughing the way they sometimes did after routine flights. Because this wasn't one of those days. This was one of the days when you came back, but not all of you made it. And the missing man hung in the air between them like a shadow, like an unspoken echo of the fight, still ringing in their ears. And James thought about how strange it was, how the human mind could accept this kind of loss as normal, how they all had learned to adjust so quickly to the absence of someone they'd eaten breakfast with just hours before, someone who had joked about the weather or rolled his eyes at the bland porridge or muttered, Something about needing new socks, and now he was just gone. No ceremony, no final words. Just a plane spiraling out of the sky, and a name that would soon be written on a board somewhere. Logged into a report, maybe read aloud at a briefing before the next mission. And James pressed his thumb against the edge of Emily's coin, still in his pocket, still warm from being held during the flight, and he thought about writing to her. Again, thought about the words he would choose, whether to mention today's loss or to keep the letter light, to talk about the weather or the meals, or the way the airfield looked at dawn when the mist rolled in from the fields. And he wondered if he'd be able to describe it honestly, if he'd ever find the right words for what it felt like to climb into a cockpit, knowing you might not come back, knowing that the person next to you might vanish mid-air, and that when you landed, the world would just keep turning. The mechanics would refuel the planes. The cooks would ladle out the same gray stew for dinner. The clocks would tick on as if nothing had changed, but everything had changed. And James rubbed his hands together now, trying to shake off the cold that had sunk into his bones during the flight, even though he was back on the ground, back where he was supposed to feel safe. But safety was a strange concept these days, something fragile and temporary, like the thin glass on his cockpit canopy, clear but easily shattered. And he remembered a line his instructor had once said during training: "The sky doesn't care who you are. Son, it treats everyone the same." And that truth had stuck with him, had followed him through every mission, and now it whispered in the back of his mind as he sat there, watching the dust float in the beam of light coming through the window, and he thought about the men who had flown before him, the pilots in the First World War who'd fought in canvas planes with open cockpits, scarves trailing in the wind, goggles icing over in the cold, and he wondered if they'd felt the same heaviness after combat, the same empty ache in the chest. And part of him wished he could ask them, wished he could sit with them somewhere quiet and say, "How did you carry it?" But he knew the answer already. You just did. You carried it because there was no other choice. Their choice. And James looked over at the locker across the room, the one that belonged to the pilot who hadn't come back today, and he wondered who would open it, who would fold the uniform, who would decide what to send home, and his stomach twisted at the thought, but he pushed it aside, because thinking too much about it wouldn't help, and there was another mission tomorrow, always another mission. And he knew that if he let the grief crack through his armor too much, he wouldn't be able to climb back into the cockpit again. So he compartmentalized, like they all did, like soldiers have always done, placing each loss into a quiet box, somewhere in the mind, closing the lid gently but firmly, and then moving forward, step by step, because that was the only way to survive. And now he stood, stretching stiff legs, moving toward the window to look out at the airfield, the runways, gleaming in the fading light, the silhouettes of planes lined up like resting birds, their noses pointed toward the hangars, and the ground crew still working, wiping oil from their hands, rolling tool carts back into the sheds. And James thought about how much he owed them, how every flight depended on those unseen hours of labor, the tightening of bolts, the careful checks of fuel lines. And he thought about Tommy, always there before dawn, always there after dark, wiping sweat from his brow, even in the cold. And James made a note to thank him tomorrow, not just with a nod, but with actual words, because the small things mattered now, more than ever. And as he watched the sky darken, he felt the pull of fatigue, the way it seeped into his muscles. But he also knew that sleep wouldn't come easy tonight, not with the memory of the dogfight still fresh, not with the sound of guns still echoing in his ears. So he stayed by the window a little longer, letting the air cool his face, watching the last of the sunlight bleed away. And he thought about the letter he'd write to Emily before bed, maybe keeping it simple, maybe just telling her he was okay, that he'd flown another mission, that the sky had been clear for a while before. It wasn't, and that he'd come back again for now. And he thought about Claire too, his little sister. who would be asleep by now, safe in her bed, dreaming of things that had nothing to do with war. And he hoped it would stay that way, hoped she'd never have to know what it felt like to sit by a window in a cold room, staring at an airfield, where friends disappeared into the sky and sometimes never came back down. And James leaned his forehead against the glass for a moment, eyes closing briefly, letting the cool surface remind him that he was still here, still breathing, still in his own skin. And then he stepped back, moving slowly toward his bunk, pulling out a notepad and pencil, the familiar weight of them in his hands, and he began to write, letting the words flow without thinking too much, letting the ritual soothe him, because writing letters was another way of flying, another way of keeping his mind steady. And as the pencil scratched against the paper, he let the sky drift away for a while, let the weight of the day settle softly into the background, knowing that tomorrow it would start again. The engines would roar, the propellers would spin, and he would climb back into the cockpit, heart steady, breath slow, eyes on the horizon. Night came slowly over the airfield, creeping in like a gentle tide rather than falling all at once. The last strips of twilight stretching across the horizon while the squadron settled into the quiet rituals of evening, and Lieutenant James Holloway found himself walking alone along the perimeter of the base, boots crunching softly over frost-hardened grass, his breath curling in pale clouds beneath the dim light of the moon, each step away to shake the restlessness from his legs, to let his mind process the day's events without the tight walls of the barracks pressing in around him. Because after missions like today's, where one of their own didn't come back, the walls seemed too close, the bunk too hard, the silence too sharp. And so he walked, jacket collar pulled up against the cold, gloves still smelling faintly of oil and leather, eyes tracing the shapes of grounded planes lined up like sleeping beasts under canvas covers, their engines silent now, their wings folded into the darkness. And he thought about the sky above, how different it looked from the ground, how up. There it was a place of speed and danger, of split-second decisions and roaring engines. But down here, it returned to being something soft, something still, the kind of sky poets wrote about, even though James knew better than to trust it. Because the sky remembered everything: the dogfights, the spirals of smoke, the parachutes that opened too late or not at all. And even now, in this moment of calm, he felt the ghosts of the day hanging in the air around him, the memories not, fading but hovering just at the edge of vision. And he let them sit there without pushing them away, because that was part of the process too, part of surviving, letting the weight settle before you locked it away again, because you couldn't. Fly with it fresh in your chest, not the next day, not when the engines spun up again, and the ground crew waved you off with tired smiles. So tonight was for remembering, for walking in the cold, for breathing in the stillness while his heart slowed back to normal. And he thought about the man they'd lost today, picturing his face, the way he used to tilt his head when he laughed, the way he rolled his eyes at the daily porridge. And James wondered how long it would take for that face to blur in his mind, for the details to fade, because war did that. It eroded memories like wind on stone, soft at first, but relentless over time. And he hated that. Hated that the human brain couldn't hold on to every detail no matter how hard it tried. And he wondered what the man's mother would get in the telegram. Whether she'd be in the kitchen when it arrived, maybe drying her hands on a towel, maybe glancing at the window and thinking about him at that very second. And James's stomach tightened at the thought. But he kept walking, kept breathing, because there was nothing else to do. No way to undo the day, no way to rewind the sky. And the airfield stretched out quietly around him, the runways slick with frost now, the hangars dark, except for one lamp near the mechanic's shed where Tommy still worked, tightening bolts on a plane scheduled for tomorrow's mission, his shadow long and thin against the hangar wall. And James thought about walking over, about helping, but he knew Tommy wouldn't let him pilots weren't supposed to touch the machines after hours, weren't supposed to mix sweat and tools, because that was a ground crew's job, and there were rules about keeping those worlds separate, not out of disrespect, but because everyone had a role to play, and the mechanics carried their own burdens, the long nights, the cold fingers on freezing metal, the knowledge that if something went wrong in the air, if a hose burst or a valve failed, it could mean death for the pilot and a lifetime of wondering. For the man who last checked the part, so James respected that, respected the quiet labor of the ground crews, the way they stayed after the planes landed, the way they cleaned the bullet holes and patched the wings, their hands moving steady, even when their eyes betrayed the same fatigue the pilots carried. And as James rounded the far edge of the field, he looked up at the stars, pinpricks of cold light scattered across the blackness, and he thought about navigation, about the times he'd flown at night with only the stars to guide him, about the maps folded in his pocket, the way the constellations became landmarks in the air, not just stories from old books, but tools of survival. And he smiled faintly, remembering a night early in the war when he'd gotten lost over the channel, the compass spinning wildly after a burst of flak had damaged the panel, and how he'd looked up at Orion's belt and made a decision based not on instruments, but on the sky itself, trusting the angle of the stars to lead him home. And somehow, it had worked. Somehow he'd crossed the water and found the base again, landing with his fuel needle buried against empty. And he'd never told anyone about that night, never admitted how close he'd come to running out of sky, because pilots kept those stories to themselves sometimes, not out of pride, but because certain memories felt too private to share, too tangled up in fear and luck to explain properly. And as he walked now, James thought about luck, about how much of flying was really just chance, about the coin in his pocket, the one Emily had given him, still there, still pressed close to his chest, and he touched it now, fingers curling around the metal, and he whispered her name softly into the night air, a sound meant for no one but himself. And then he whispered Claire's name too, his sister, picturing her asleep in her bed, safe from the war for now, and he let those names settle in his mouth like anchors, like weights, to keep him grounded while the wind whispered through the grass at his feet. And he thought about tomorrow's mission, about the target briefing that would come at dawn, about the map spread out on the table, the lines drawn in pencil showing the route, the potential flak zones, the areas where enemy fighters might be waiting. And he tried to imagine himself back in the cockpit already, hands on the stick, goggles fogging slightly, breath slow in the oxygen mask. But part of him stayed right here, right now, walking the edge of the airfield with the frost crunching under his boots, because this was the part of the day that belonged to no one else, the part where he could let his guard down just a little, where he didn't have to perform the role of the calm pilot. The steady voice on the radio, the man who never flinched, because they all flinch sometimes, even if no one said it out loud. And as James reached the end of the runway and turned back toward the barracks, he felt his legs growing heavy, tiredness finally catching up with him. But he didn't mind it, didn't resent the exhaustion, because it was proof he was still here, still walking, still breathing in this cold night air. And tomorrow he'd do it all again, because that's what the job demanded, and he would do it not just for duty, not just for the medals or the missions, but for the men who couldn't walk this perimeter tonight, for the ones who had stayed behind in the sky, their stories ending in smoke and silence. And he carried them with him now, their names unspoken, but present like shadows at his side. And as he neared the barracks, the lights low in the windows, the soft murmur of voices inside, he paused one last time, looking back at the hangars, at the planes resting in the dark, and he closed his eyes briefly, letting the cold wind cut across his face, letting the night remind him that he was still alive, still part of this strange, fragile world of men and machines, of flight and memory. And then he stepped forward again, moving toward the door, toward sleep, toward whatever the next day would bring. Sleep in wartime never came easy, especially not for pilots. And for Lieutenant James Holloway, the hours after midnight were often the hardest, not because of the cold or the aching muscles from long missions, but because of the way the mind played tricks in the dark, turning the silence of the barracks into a canvas for memory, for worry, for replaying the events of the day over and over until sleep was just a distant idea. And tonight was no different, as he lay in his narrow bunk, eyes open, staring at the ceiling where faint shadows from the hallway lamp flickered against the cracked plaster. His hands folded across his stomach, his flight jacket still draped over the end of the bed, the coin Emily had given him resting on his chest, its familiar cool weight grounding him in the present moment, even as his thoughts drifted back into the cockpit, back into the sky, back into the sharp moments of the dogfight that had claimed one of his friends. And he wondered how long it would take for the images to fade, the flash of gunfire, a burst of smoke from a wingtip, the way the horizon tilted as he'd pulled into a turn, heart pounding but breath slow, always slow, because panic in the us. Air meant death, but now, on the ground, there was no mission to focus on, no enemy to track, just the ceiling, just the soft breaths of the other pilots seeping around him, or pretending to sleep, because James knew he wasn't the only one awake. Not really, not with the kind of day they'd had. And he thought about the man who was missing now, thought about his locker still standing silent in the corner, the cup he'd left on the windowsill, the scarf he'd draped over his chair. And James wondered who would clean it all out, who would write the official letter to the family, who would find the words that no one wanted to say. And his stomach twisted again as it always did after a loss. But he didn't move, didn't shift in his bunk, just kept his breathing steady, in through the nose, out through the mouth, like he'd done in the cockpit, because rhythm was a kind of survival. And tonight, in the cold room with its thin blankets and harder thoughts, survival meant making it to morning without letting the walls close in too tight. And as he lay there, his mind wandered to the letters stacked in his footlocker, the ones he'd written. To Emily, but hadn't sent yet. Letters where he'd tried to explain what flying felt like without frightening her. Tried to put into words the strange mix of terror and beauty. The way the clouds looked from above. The way the sunlight bounced off the wings. The way your heart clenched when you saw a friend go down. But you had to keep flying. Had to keep breathing. Because if you stopped, even for a second, the sky would eat you alive. And he thought about writing another letter tonight. Maybe in the morning before the next briefing. Maybe after breakfast when the mess hall was quiet. But he knew that no words could really capture this. Not fully. And so he stayed still. Eyes tracing cracks in the ceiling. Counting breaths. Counting seconds. Letting the cold seep into his hands where they rested on his stomach. And he thought about home, about Claire, probably dreaming in her warm bed. The war a faraway story in the newspaper. Her big brother just a name on a postcard now and then. And Jane smiled faintly. A sad smile, because he liked it that way. Liked that she didn't know the details. Didn't know about the burned planes. The bullet holes in wings. The oil stains on hands that trembled in the dark after missions. And he hoped she never would. Hoped she'd grow up in a world where the sky was just the sky. Not a battlefield. Not a graveyard for pilots who didn't make it back. And he thought about the other side, too. About the German pilots he'd fought today. Men not so different from him. Men who had mothers and sisters and letters in lockers. And he wondered if any of them were lying awake right now in their own barracks, staring at their own ceilings, thinking about the friends they'd lost. Because war wasn't personal. At 20,000 feet, it was just machine against machine. Reflex against reflex. And sometimes when James thought about that, his chest tightened, not from guilt exactly, but from the weight of it all. The sheer human cost of this endless sky dance. And he closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the hum of the airfield outside, the distant rumble of a generator, the soft creak of wood as someone turned in a bunk across the room. And he thought about the rituals they all kept, the lucky charms, the whispered names before takeoff, the coins in pockets, the letters folded into flight jackets, and he wondered if the enemy pilots did the same, if they touched photographs before climbing into cockpits, if they whispered names into the cold air, if they prayed to the same indifferent sky. And he let his mind drift like that, tracing the edges of thought without falling too deep into sorrow, because that was the trick, keeping the mind balanced on the thin line between memory and focus, between grief and function. And tomorrow there would be another mission. There always was, because war didn't pause for feelings, didn't wait for wounds to heal. And he thought about the map that would be unrolled in the morning, about the red lines drawn across it, about the target, about the briefing officers. Voice explaining the dangers, and he pictured himself climbing back into the Spitfire, gloves on the stick, goggles fogging slightly before clearing, the Merlin engine humming beneath him like a living thing, and he let that image settle in his mind, because it was easier than thinking about the faces of the lost, easier than letting the darkness pull him too far down. And he touched the coin again, rolled it between his fingers, felt the familiar edge that always calmed him. Emily's gift, her way of staying close even when she wasn't here. And he whispered her name softly, a breath of sound in the quiet room. And then he whispered Claire's too, because he always did, and he promised them both silently that he would keep going, that he would fly again tomorrow, because that was the job, because someone had to. And he thought about the bombers he'd protect, the heavy aircraft moving slowly through the sky, their crews counting on men like him to keep the path clear. And he thought about the mechanics working in the cold hangars, tightening bolts, checking fuel lines, wiping oil from their hands as they prepared for the next day's missions. And he let the weight of all of it press into his chest, but not crush him, because this was the life he had chosen, or maybe it had chosen him, and he would carry it as long as he had to. And finally, slowly, his eyes grew heavier, the ceiling blurred, the sounds of the barracks faded into the background, and his breath evened out, one hand still resting lightly on the coin. And he let himself drift, not into dreams exactly, but into a kind of half-sleep, the kind pilots learned in war, where the mind never fully lets go, where part of you stays ready even in rest, because the morning always comes fast, and when it does, you have to be ready to climb back into the sky. Morning came before the sky was fully light, as it always did on mission days, not with a sunrise that invited peace, but with the mechanical rhythm of boots on wooden floors, the rustle of uniforms being pulled on in the cold, the soft metallic clinks of zippers and harnesses and buckles as the men of the squadron prepared for another day in the air. And Lieutenant James Holloway found himself moving through the motions like a man walking through a dream he'd already had 100 times before, pulling on his flight jacket, checking his gloves for small tears, even though he knew there were none, folding the same letters and placing them in the same pocket, the same small silver coin pressed flat against his chest. And he glanced around the barracks to see the others doing the same, each man quiet, eyes focused on the floor or on their hands, no one speaking unless necessary, because they all knew the drill. They all knew that words bore a mission were heavy things, dangerous things, because they carried too much meaning when the odds were uncertain. So they saved their breath, saved their small talk for after, if there was an after. And James laced his boots tightly, standing for a moment to stretch his back, feeling the stiffness from yesterday's flight still lingering in his muscles, the soreness in his neck from keeping his head on a swivel, always looking, always scanning the sky for threats. And then he grabbed his helmet and goggles, stepping out into the cold morning air where the ground crews were already busy, mechanics hunched over open engine cowlings, wiping frost from windshields, rolling fuel carts between rows of planes that stood like silent sentinels waiting for orders. their propellers still for now, but ready to spin into life at the first signal. And the smell of oil and canvas wrapped around James as he walked toward the briefing hut, boots crunching over gravel, his breath rising in white plumes that vanished into the thin dawn air. And inside the hut, the map was already unrolled on the table, red and blue lines drawn across it, altitude notes scribbled in pencil, target areas circled with thick markers, and the briefing officer stood at the front, tapping a stick against the paper as he spoke, his voice steady, his tone practiced, because he'd given this talk 100 times before and would give it 100 times again if the war lasted that long. And James took a seat on the wooden bench, listening with part of his mind while the other part drifted, cataloging small details, the way the frost on the windows caught the morning light, the way someone 2 seats over tapped a pencil against his knee, the way his own gloves creaked softly as he flexed his fingers. But then he forced himself to focus, pulling his mind back to the mission, because details mattered. Routes mattered, fuel mattered, flak positions mattered. And he memorized the coordinates, tracing them in his mind, imagining the waypoints, the climb to altitude, the rendezvous with the bombers they were assigned to escort today. And he thought about those bomber crews, men climbing into heavy aircraft. Right now, men strapping into gunner positions, checking their ammunition, running their own rituals in parallel with his. And he felt a quiet connection to them, even though they'd probably never meet, because their lives depended on him today, just as his had depended on others yesterday. And that thought settled in his chest like a weight, but also like a purpose, a reason to keep going even when the sky felt too heavy. And as the briefing ended, the pilots stood, their faces pale in the cold light, each man lost in his own preparations. And James walked back to his Spitfire, running his hand along the wing as he passed, feeling the cold metal beneath his glove. A habit now, a ritual he didn't even think about anymore. And Tommy was there, as always, tightening bolts, checking panels, giving James the usual silent nod instead of words, because words were too much sometimes. And James returned the nod, climbing into the cockpit, settling into the seat that felt like a second skin, like a place he both loved and hated at the same time, because it meant control, but it also meant risk. And he strapped in, pulling the harness tight, checking his instruments, running through the checklist by feel and memory, each switch, each lever, a familiar friend or foe depending on the day. And then the engine started, the Merlin roaring to life beneath him, the propeller spinning faster until it became a blur. And James felt the vibration through his seat, through his legs, through his heart, and he let it calm him, let the mechanical rhythm drown out the noise in his head, because the cockpit was the only place where his thoughts truly slowed, where everything narrowed into focus, into the tasks at hand, into the moment, and the squadron taxied out onto the runway, each plane falling into line, engines rumbling in unison. And James adjusted his goggles, watching the world shift into the muted tones of glass and leather and frost, the sky ahead a pale canvas waiting to be painted with the day's events, whatever they might be. And the radio crackled softly in his ear, the command to take off coming through with the usual clipped formality. And then his plane rolled forward, gaining speed, wheels leaving the ground in a smooth arc. And the earth fell away beneath him, the air taking hold, the Spitfire climbing into the sky with a cold cut sharper than any knife. And as they formed up, the squadron sliding into their practiced V-shape, James kept his hands light on the controls, eyes moving constantly, checking gauges, checking the horizon, watching for enemy fighters that might be lurking already. Though it was early, and for now the sky stayed empty, just clouds and sunlight, and the steady hum of engines. And he let his breathing slow, let the rhythm settle in, because he knew the day would be long, the flight hours stretching ahead. And pacing himself mattered, just like in the dogfights, just like in the waiting, because war wasn't just about action. It was about endurance, about staying sharp through the lulls, about keeping your mind from drifting too far into memory or fear. And James thought again about the coin in his pocket, about the letters folded in his flight jacket, about the last letter he'd written to Emily last night before finally drifting into sleep. A letter he might never send, but writing it had helped, had kept his hands steady. And now those same hands gripped the control stick gently but firmly, adjusting for turbulence, watching the squadron stay in formation, the other planes moving with precision, each pilot locked into his own world of metal and sky. And the minutes ticked by, the earth sliding silently below, the rivers winding through fields, the towns just smudges on the map from this altitude. And then the bombers appeared on the horizon, heavy B-17s and Lancasters, their formations tight, their silver bodies catching the sunlight like slow-moving stars. And James felt his chest tighten, not from fear, but from the knowledge of what came next, because every pilot knew the routine. The bombers would draw the flak, would draw the fighters, and the squadron's job was to shield them, to clear the sky as best they could, to keep those crews alive long enough to drop their payloads and turn for home. And he thought about the men inside those bombers, the gunners peering out of tiny windows, the pilots gripping their controls, the navigators tracing lines on charts. And he knew that every one of them carried their own rituals, their own small superstitions, their own ways of holding on to life in a place where life was so easily lost. And he wondered if they carried coins too, if they whispered names before takeoff, if they thought about home as the engines roared. And he let that thought ride alongside him as the squadron slid into escort position, engines humming in harmony now, the dance of protection beginning. And James adjusted his throttle, eyes scanning the sky, breath steady, mind calm, because he was ready, because this was what they did, day after day, flight after flight, climbing into the cold air, not because they wanted to, but because someone had to. And as the horizon stretched out before him, James whispered Emily's name once more, whispered Claire's too, and then he let the ritual fade into the background as the mission took over. As the sky became the only thing that mattered, the higher you climbed, the thinner the air became, not just physically but emotionally, as if the act of rising above the earth peeled layers away from your mind until only the most basic thoughts remain. Stay alive, protect the others, don't think too much about tomorrow. And for Lieutenant James Holloway, now cruising at altitude in formation with his squadron and the lumbering bomber group they were tasked with escorting, that thinning of thought was both a blessing and a curse, because while it cleared away the distractions of ordinary life, it also magnified the small, persistent voices that lived in the corners of his mind, the ones that whispered what if and remember when and who's next. But he had learned how to manage those voices by turning the cockpit into a sanctuary of routine, of ritual, of focus so tight it left no room for panic. And today was no different. His hands light on the controls, fingers brushing the familiar surfaces of the throttle and stick, his eyes moving in steady patterns across the sky, left, right, up, down, check the instruments, scan the horizon, back to center, and repeat. And even though the cold seeped into his gloves and the oxygen mask pressed tightly against his face, he stayed calm, stayed inside the process, because that's what kept him alive. And as the bombers crawled forward, heavy and slow, James kept his position just above and to the side, watching for enemy fighters that might try to dive from the sun, the classic tactic, using glare as camouflage. And he squinted through his goggles, searching the bright sky for the first hints of trouble, knowing it was coming, because it always came, because no bomber run went unchallenged for long. And sure enough, after nearly an hour of smooth flying, the first warning crackled through his headset, one of the other pilots calling out contacts. At high 12 o'clock, fast movers closing from altitude, and James felt his body shift into that familiar state of readiness. Not fear, but focus, the transition from escort to combat smooth as breath. And he tightened his grip on the stick just slightly, adjusted his trim, banked the Spitfire to get a better view. And there they were, black specks growing larger, the enemy fighters diving in pairs. And he recognized them instantly, Messerschmitt. 109s, their angular profiles cutting through the sunlight like arrows, sleek and fast and deadly. And his mind calculated angles and speeds before he even realized he was doing it. Muscle memory from dozens of missions telling him when to climb, when to turn, when to engage, and the squadron leader's voice came over the radio, calm and clipped. Red flight, intercept, blue flight, cover the bombers. And James peeled away from formation, pulling his Spitfire into a climbing arc to meet the attackers. Heart steady, breath even, because there was no room for nerves now, only for precision, for reaction, and the sky became a chessboard of moving pieces. The enemy diving, the defenders climbing, contrails looping and twisting as the first bursts of gunfire lit the air, and James picked his target, locked eyes onto a Messerschmitt diving toward the bomber formation, and he rolled his plane into position, nose down, throttle forward, engine roaring as he chased the enemy fighter into a steep bank, pulling G's that pressed him into the seat, but his breathing stayed slow, his mind clear, his eyes sharp as he lined up the shot, squeezed the trigger, felt the vibration of the guns rattling the wings, saw tracers arc toward the enemy plane, saw metal peel back, smoke bloom from the engine, and then the Messerschmitt rolled over and dove away, trailing black, disappearing into the clouds below. And James didn't follow. He knew better than to chase a damaged plane into the unknown, not with more threats still circling, and he pulled back into position, scanning for the next attacker. And it didn't take long, another pair of enemy fighters closing fast from the rear, aiming for the bombers, and James banked again, climbed into position, fired a short burst to scare them off, watched as one broke left, the other right, and he picked the right-hand fighter, rolled into a turn to follow, the Spitfire's wings slicing through thin air, engine humming in his ears. His world narrowed now to just the dance of pursuit, of angles and speed, of matching turns without overshooting, and he got close enough to see the markings on the enemy fuselage, close enough to see the pilot glance back, and for a split second, their eyes met, two men in different machines, two men who might have shared a drink in another life, but now locked into a life-or-death spiral. And James fired again, saw rounds strike the tail, but the German pilot was good. He rolled into. A dive, pulled into the clouds, vanished from sight, and James didn't follow this one either, because the first rule of combat was stay alive, and chasing too deep into enemy airspace was how pilots got shot down. So he climbed back toward the bombers, eyes scanning for fresh threats, and he saw his squadron mates locked in their own. Dogfights saw the sky become a swirl of machines, engines screaming, wings banking, tracer rounds stitching the air, and above it all the bombers pressed on, slow and steady, like moving cities in the sky, their gunners firing in short bursts, the flashes lighting up their tiny windows, and James protected them as best he could, diving, climbing, firing when he had a shot, pulling away when he didn't, always keeping his head on a swivel, always scanning the sky because you never knew when another fighter would appear. And he thought of the boys inside those bombers, sweating in their oxygen masks, counting the seconds until they reached the target. And he thought of Emily back home, probably making tea right now, probably unaware that he was spinning through the air in a twisting ballet of life and death. And he touched the coin in his pocket again between maneuvers, a quick press against his chest like a silent prayer, and he whispered her name once, more into the oxygen mask, letting it mix with the engine noise, because rituals mattered, especially here, especially now. and the fight continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, time stretching and warping the way it always did in combat. And eventually, the enemy fighters began to peel away, fuel running low, their attacks less aggressive. Now, and James stayed with the bombers, escorting them past the worst of it, heart still pounding, but his mind calm, his breathing controlled, the way it had to be. And as the sky cleared and the formation reassembled, he looked around at the other planes, counted the squadron, felt the familiar ache in his chest when he saw one missing, knew without needing to ask that someone hadn't made it. And he carried that weight in silence as he always did, letting it settle in the same pocket as the coin, letting it mix with the memories of other losses, other days, because there was no time to grieve up here. Not yet. And the bombers turned for home, engines rumbling low and steady, and James flew beside them, his hands light on the controls again. The danger passed for now, but the tension still sitting beneath his skin like a second layer. And he thought about landing, about the debrief, about the empty seat in the mess hall tonight, and he thought about writing another letter when he got back. Maybe to Emily, maybe to Claire, maybe to himself, just to get the words out. And he kept his eyes on the horizon, on the way the sky stretched out forever ahead, and he whispered his promises again, silent vows to the ones he loved, and he kept. Flying, kept breathing, because that's what pilots did. That's what they had to do, even when the sky turned back to blue and the world below looked peaceful again. The long flight back from a mission was often the quietest part of the day. Not because the sky was silent, engines still hummed, radio still crackled now and then, but because the minds of the pilots slipped into a different kind of space, a kind of reflective limbo where the adrenaline faded, but the consequences of the fight hovered close. And Lieutenant James Holloway felt that now, as he guided his Spitfire back toward base, the bombers lumbering alongside the squadron, their engines droning in steady rhythms that had become as familiar to him as his own breathing. And he thought about the battle they'd just come through, the tracers that had streaked the sky like orange needles, the smoke trails curling into the upper atmosphere, the sudden flickers of fire that marked the moments when machines broke apart and men became memories. And he knew, without even counting, that one of their own hadn't made it back, because there was a space in the formation where a plane should have been. And that empty space pressed on his chest harder than any G-force from a dogfight ever could. But he didn't let it break his focus, didn't let it fog his mind, because the flight home was still dangerous. Planes ran low on fuel, engines coughed and sputtered. Enemy stragglers sometimes followed formations all the way back to base, looking for easy kills. So you couldn't relax. Not yet, not until the wheels touched down. And even then, relaxation wasn't the right word, because the mind never really shut off after missions like this. It just went into storage mode, boxing up the day's memories, tucking them into corners for later. And James stayed in that state now, his hands light on the controls, his eyes scanning the sky in slow, practiced sweeps, making sure the air stayed clear. And he listened to the quiet chatter on the radio, altitude checks, fuel reports, confirmation, of course headings, and he thought about how routine it all sounded, even though they just lived through something chaotic, something deadly. And that was part of the job too, turning terror into procedure, smoothing over the rough edges with discipline and habit, because if you let the emotion stay raw, it would tear you apart. And James had learned that lesson long ago, back in the first few months of his tour, when he'd watched new pilots burn out because they couldn't find the balance between feeling and functioning. But he'd found his own way through it, his own rituals, touching the coin in his pocket, whispering names into his oxygen mask, keeping his breath slow, staying inside the rhythm of the machine. And as he flew now, the cold air slipping through the seams of his goggles, he thought about the things no one talked about in the official reports, the moments between the missions, the long hours in the sky when nothing happened, but your mind kept spinning, running loops of memory, loops of worry, loops of quiet promises made to people far away. And he thought of Emily, wondered if she was at work right now, or maybe sitting by the radio, hoping not to hear bad news. And he thought of Claire, probably, still in school at this hour, scribbling in notebooks, drawing pictures of airplanes, because she didn't know the real details of what he did in the sky. And James preferred it that way, wanted her to think of flight as something beautiful, something free, not something heavy with death and duty. And he let that thought settle in his chest, mixing with the cold, mixing with the ache in his shoulders from the long flight. And the squadron stayed tight, engines humming in unison, the bombers trailing smoke from minor damage, but mostly intact. And James counted that as a victory, even though it didn't feel like one. Not really, because the missing pilot's absence weighed more than the success of the mission. And he wondered who would write the letter to that man's family, who would pack up his locker, who would clean out his personal effects. And James hated that part of the job, hated that war made you think in terms of logistics when you wanted to think, in terms of people. But he understood it too, understood that the machine of war had gears that turned no matter how you felt. And now he checked his fuel gauge again, tapped it gently with a gloved knuckle. Part of the ritual, part of keeping his mind anchored. And he adjusted his throttle, staying in formation, scanning the sky one more time for threats, even though the horizon was clear now. Just layers of soft clouds and the thin blue line where the earth curved away. And he thought about the way the sky looked when you weren't fighting, how it could almost fool you into thinking the world was still normal, still safe. But James had learned not to trust that view, had learned to see the sky as both a place of beauty and a place of danger, because it was both, always both. And as they approached the coastline, the first hints of home beneath them, he felt the familiar shift in his stomach, the small tightening that came with knowing you'd made it this far, but still had to land, still had to bring the plane down safely, because landing wasn't a guarantee either, not in wartime, not with engines strained from combat, not with fuel gauges flirting with empty. And he thought about the mechanics waiting on the ground, about Tommy wiping his hands on an oil rag, watching the planes return, counting them, realizing who was missing. And James felt a pang of guilt, even though he knew he wasn't responsible, even though he'd done everything right, flown his mission, protected the bombers, stayed alive. But that survivor's ache never really went away. And he let it sit there quietly as he set up for descent, adjusting his trim, checking his instruments one more time, the landing checklist running through his mind automatically. Wheels down, flaps set, speed perfect, and the runway came into view. A strip of gray cutting through the green fields, and his hands stayed steady on the stick, his eyes locked onto the approach, and the plane touched down with a gentle bounce. Tires squealing softly against the tarmac, and then the ground rushed back into control, the sky falling away as the Spitfire taxied toward its parking spot, and the engine idled down, the vibrations fading, replaced by a silence that wasn't really silent, because his ears still rang with the memory of gunfire, of engines at full throttle, of radio chatter during the fight. But it was a different kind of quiet now, a heavy one, and James sat there for a moment, hands still on the controls, letting his breath slow, letting his heart settle. And then he unbuckled his harness, pushed back the canopy, felt the cold air slap his face, sharper now without the engine heat, and he climbed out, boots hitting the ground with a dull thud. And Tommy was there waiting, eyes tired but focused, giving James the usual nod. And James returned it, the ritual exchange of glances and gestures that said everything without saying anything, because the ground crews knew, the pilots knew. Everyone knew what it meant when a plane came back with one spot empty in the formation. And as James walked toward the hangar, flight jacket unzipped now, gloves stuffed into his pockets, he felt the familiar ache in his legs, the stiffness in his back, But he also felt the weight of memory pressing in, the images from the dogfight, looping behind his eyes, and he knew they'd stay there for a while, maybe forever. And he thought about writing it all down later, thought about picking up his pencil and filling another page of his notebook with words he might never share. But for now, he just kept walking, the airfield stretching out in front of him, the sky above turning a softer blue as the sun shifted behind clouds, and he thought about tomorrow, about the next mission, because there was always a next mission. And he whispered Emily's name again, whispered Claire's too, and he let those names steady him as he moved forward, step by step, through the familiar rituals of returning from war. Some nights after a mission, the airfield felt like a ghost town, not because it was empty. There were still mechanics working under hanging lamps, still ground crew wheeling carts and checking fuel lines, still the faint hum of generators somewhere out near the sheds. But because the weight of the day pressed down so heavily that it silenced everything else, muffling sounds, slowing movements, turning conversations into whispers. And Lieutenant James Holloway felt that weight now as he sat alone near the edge of the dispersal area. The Spitfires parked in rows behind him under canvas tarps, the smell of oil and frost lingering in the air, his flight helmet resting beside him on the wooden crate where he perched, his goggles hanging loose around his neck, and in his hands, the small silver coin spun slowly between his fingers, a quiet ritual he'd fallen into over the months, the motion calming his mind the way nothing else could, because flying emptied you out, drained the energy from your body, but left your brain spinning like a propeller, replaying the flight over and over, the dogfight, the radio calls, the moments when the sky had lit up with tracer rounds and someone's engine had caught fire. And tonight was no different. The images still played behind his eyes. The missing pilot's absence already turning into that sharp kind of ache in his chest that wouldn't fully hit until later, maybe not until the morning when they counted beds at roll call or when someone noticed the empty chair at breakfast. But for now, James just sat there in the cold, letting the night wrap around him like a blanket stitched from exhaustion and memory. And he thought about how strange it was, this life they lived, how quickly you could go from the roar of combat to the stillness of reflection, how fast the hands could shift from gripping the stick in a climb to holding a coin in the dark. And he wondered if it would ever feel normal, if there would ever come a day when he wouldn't need to walk out here alone after a mission just to breathe, just to settle the spinning inside his head. But he doubted it, because war had a way of making habits out of survival. And this was his way of staying grounded, of coming back down not just in the plane, but in his mind. And he looked up at the sky now, the stars so clear it hurt his eyes, the air cold enough to bite at the corners of his mouth where the oxygen mask had left red lines on his skin. And he thought about the men flying on the other side tonight, German pilots in their own cockpits, perhaps sitting in their own quiet fields right now, staring at the same stars, wondering about the same things. And the thought both comforted and unsettled him, because war turned enemies into shadows, but also into reflections of yourself if you thought too long about it. And James tried not to think too long about it, tried instead to focus on what was in front of him, the coin, the night, the cold metal of his aircraft, gleaming faintly in the moonlight. And he thought about the letter he would write tonight, or try to write, because sometimes the words didn't come, not when the mind was this full, but he would try, because writing to Emily kept his hands steady, kept his heart tethered to something soft and human, something far away from the violence of the sky. And he would tell her about the routine things, about the weather, about the meals, about the mechanics and their jokes. But he would leave out the parts about the fire, about the way the enemy planes had swarmed today, about the way the sky had swallowed one of his friends again, because she didn't need to carry that weight, not yet, not while she still had the softness of peacetime life back home. And he wanted her to keep it, wanted her to hold on to something normal for both of them. And he whispered her name now, just softly into the cold air, letting it mix with his breath, letting it float into the darkness like smoke. And then he whispered Claire's name too, his little sister, because he always did, because the habit comforted him in a way nothing else could. And he thought about how he'd tell her stories one day, stories that left out the worst parts, that painted the sky as a place of freedom instead of fear. And maybe that was the best any of them could hope for, to survive long enough to choose which stories to tell when the war was over, if it ever ended. And he closed his eyes for a moment, just listening, letting the hum of the airfield settle into his ears, the distant clang of tools, the murmur of a mechanic swearing softly as he worked, the far-off sound of someone coughing in the barracks. And he let all of it remind him that he was still here, still breathing, still part of the living. And he thought about tomorrow's mission already, because that was how the cycle worked. One flight ended, and the next one loomed immediately. No real pause between them, except for these small hours at night, these pockets of silence where the mind tried to catch up with the body. And he wondered where they'd be sent tomorrow, what the target would be, what the weather would do, whether the enemy would come at them from high or low, whether they'd lose another man. And he hated that part of it, the guessing, the constant gambling of lives against weather reports and enemy tactics. But he also knew he couldn't change it, couldn't control it. And so he focused on what he could control, the way he checked his plane, the way he folded his letters, the way he touched the coin before every flight. And he let those small actions build walls around his mind, walls that kept the chaos out at least for a little while. And he thought about the mechanics again, about Tommy wiping down tools right now under a flickering bulb. And he felt gratitude for the men who kept the planes flying, who worked in the cold and the dark without the same glory, but with just as much courage, because they knew that every bolt they tightened, every hose they checked, could mean the difference between life and death for a pilot. And James made a silent promise to thank them properly tomorrow, to make sure they knew how much it mattered. And he thought about how war turned ordinary things into sacred ones: fuel lines, parachute straps, leather gloves warmed in pockets before dawn. And he thought about how he'd never noticed those details before the war, how he'd never understood what it meant to put your life in the hands of another person's maintenance, another person's checklist. But now he knew. Now he carried that knowledge in his bones. And he wondered how long it would stay with him after the war, if there was an after, if he made it through. And he thought about the boys back home who hadn't flown yet, the ones still in training, the ones still reading manuals and dreaming of dogfights. And he wished he could tell them the truth, that the sky wasn't just adventure. It was loss, it was cold, it was loneliness at altitude. It was the sound of your own breathing in a cockpit while you waited for something terrible to happen. But he also knew he wouldn't tell them, because they needed to believe in the glory for a little while longer, needed to hold on to the romance of flight until reality caught up with them. And he wondered if that was cruel or kind. But either way, it was how things worked. And he sighed now, breath fogging in the cold, and he slid the coin back into his pocket, stood slowly, feeling the stiffness in his legs from sitting too long in the chill. And he looked out over the airfield one last time before turning back toward the barracks, his boots crunching softly over the frozen ground. And he told himself he'd sleep tonight, or at least try, because tomorrow would come fast, the way it always did, with new maps, new targets, new dangers. And he'd climb into the cockpit again, hands steady, breath slow, eyes sharp. And he whispered one more time into the night, "Come back to me," not sure whether he meant himself or the friend he'd lost today. But either way, he let the words float into the cold air as he walked back toward the warm lights of the barracks, ready to face another day. Morning always came earlier than expected on the airfield, not because the sun rose faster in wartime, but because sleep never felt long enough, especially after a day like yesterday. And Lieutenant James Holloway woke to the sound of footsteps outside the barracks. the muffled clang of metal on metal, the voices of the ground crew already at work before the first cup of tea had even been poured. And for a moment he lay there, eyes half open, staring at the wooden ceiling above his bunk, the thin blanket pulled up to his chin, his flight jacket folded at the foot of the bed, his boots lined up neatly below, and for a brief second he let himself pretend he was anywhere else, that this wasn't another mission day, that the sounds outside were part of some ordinary life he'd left behind years ago. But the ache in his shoulders reminded him, the stiffness in his neck, the dryness in his throat from the thin oxygen at altitude, and he sighed, sitting up slowly, feet finding the cold floor, hands rubbing sleep from his eyes, and he reached instinctively into the pocket of his jacket for the coin Emily had given him, fingers curling around it the way they always did. A small ritual that meant more now than it ever had in the beginning, because rituals kept the mind from falling apart, kept the hands steady when they needed to grip the stick at 20,000 feet. And as he stood, stretching quietly so as not to wake the others who still slept, he thought about the briefing that would come soon, about the target, about the flight plan, and his stomach twisted in that familiar way, not quite fear, not quite dread, but something heavier, something that lived in the bones of every man who flew daily into the jaws of war. And he dressed in layers, pulling on his wool sweater, his scarf, his flight suit, gloves shoved into his pockets for now, goggles looped loosely around his neck, and he stepped outside into the cold air, the frost crunching under his boots, his breath curling in the dawn light, and he walked toward the mess hall where the other pilots were beginning to gather, their faces pale in the early morning, eyes hollow from lack of sleep, but determined to pretend otherwise, and they ate quietly, spoons scraping against tin bowls of thin porridge, mugs of wheat tea cradled in cold hands, no one saying much because there wasn't much to say not before a mission, not when you didn't know who'd be sitting at the table tomorrow. And James watched the steam rise from his cup, watched it curl into the air and vanish, and he thought about the boy they'd lost yesterday, about how his bunk was already empty, his locker already quiet, and he wondered if anyone had written to his mother yet, or if they were still deciding how to phrase it, how to soften the blow that couldn't really be softened. And after breakfast, they gathered in the briefing room, boots clunking on wooden floors, the air inside warmer but still tight with tension. The map rolled out again, the targets circled in red, the routes drawn in sharp lines that didn't show the chaos to come. And the officer pointed with his stick, explaining flak zones, enemy airfields, estimated threats, and James memorized it all. Not because he trusted the plan to go exactly that way, but because knowing the details gave him something to hold on to, gave him control over the parts he could control. And when the briefing ended, they stood and filed out, heading toward the flight line where the planes waited, engines already warming under the watchful eyes of mechanics who'd worked through the night, checking fuel, tightening bolts, wiping frost from wings, and James found his Spitfire, running his gloved hand along the fuselage as he always did, a silent greeting, a way of saying, "Let's get through this." And Tommy was there, as usual, wiping his hands on a rag, eyes red from lack of sleep, but steady, and he gave James a small nod, no words exchanged, because words were too risky at this moment. And James climbed into the cockpit, sliding into the seat, strapping in, checking the instruments with the same methodical precision he always used, because the smallest detail missed could mean disaster at altitude, and he pulled his goggles over his eyes, adjusted his mask, felt the coin pressing against his chest beneath the layers of flight gear, and he whispered Emily's name once into the fabric of the mask, just as he did before every flight, and then he whispered Claire's, too, because the ritual wasn't complete without it. And the engine roared to life beneath him, the propeller spinning into a blur, the vibration running up through his legs, into his spine, becoming part of him the way it always did. and he let the sound of the Merlin engine settle his nerves. The familiar hum steadying his hands, and as the squadron taxied out onto the runway, the bombers already climbing into the sky ahead, James felt the shift inside him. The moment when thought faded and instinct took over, when the world narrowed. Down to gauges and sky, to formation and focus, and his wheels left the ground, the Spitfire lifting into the cold air, the earth falling away beneath him until it became a patchwork of fields and rivers, the airfield shrinking behind him, and he climbed to altitude, the oxygen hissing softly into his mask, his eyes scanning the horizon for threats, even though it was still early. The enemy fighters not yet in sight, but always expected, always imagined in the corners of vision until they appeared for real, and the squadron fell into formation. Engines humming in close harmony, the radios crackling with short, clipped messages, altitude checks, position calls. No one wasting words, because there was nothing left to say that hadn't been said already in letters home, in quiet moments before sleep, in the silence of shared danger. And James kept his eyes moving, left, right, up, down, scanning the sky, for flashes of light, for movement that didn't belong. And he thought about the flight ahead, about the way the bombers moved like slow giants in the sky, their bellies full of bombs, their crews counting on the fighters to keep the path clear. And he felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. Not heavy exactly, but constant, like the pull of gravity at altitude. And he adjusted his throttle, checked his fuel gauge, tapped the compass once as he always did, a small ritual that calmed his mind. And the clouds stretched out beneath them now, soft and white. But James knew better than to trust the calm, knew that the enemy could be hiding in those clouds, waiting for the right moment to dive. And he thought about the last time they'd flown this route, about the way the sky had lit up with gunfire, about the smoke trails, the parachutes opening too late, the way the air had smelled of cordite and oil. And he pushed those images aside for now, locked them into the back of his mind where they could wait until after, because thinking about them now wouldn't help, wouldn't change what was coming. And the bombers lumbered forward, their engines low and heavy, their gunners scanning the sky just as James was, eyes sharp behind goggles, hearts beating behind layers of leather and wool, and the minutes stretched long as they flew. The horizon, unrolling in front of them, the cold seeping into gloves and boots despite the layers. And James kept moving his hands slightly, flexing fingers to keep the blood flowing, eyes never stopping, scanning, always scanning, because that was the job, not just fighting, but waiting for the fight, being ready for the moment when the sky changed from blue to chaos. And he thought about home again, about Emily, about the promise he'd made to come back. And he wondered if promises like that counted when you made them to yourself, whispered into an oxygen mask at altitude. And he decided they did, because you had to believe in something up here, something other than just metal and fuel and sky. And he let the ritual hold him together, the rhythm of breath, the touch of the coin, the sound of the engine humming beneath him. And he flew on, eyes sharp, mind calm, body ready for whatever came next. There's a moment during long escort missions when the sky feels like it stretches wider than the mind can handle, when the horizon melts into a soft blur, and the cockpit becomes not just a machine, but a sealed world of its own, a capsule hanging in the cold at altitude. And Lieutenant James Holloway was inside that moment now, flying steady alongside the bomber formation, his Spitfire humming beneath him like part of his own heartbeat. The drone of the Merlin engine no longer a sound he consciously heard, but something absorbed into his bloodstream, into his very breathing. And he kept his eyes moving in slow, practiced patterns. Left, right, up, down, check the clouds, check the contrails, check the bombers, because that was the rhythm of survival. And as the minutes stretched on, the sun climbing higher behind a veil of thin ice crystals that caught the light and made the whole world shimmer like a memory, he thought about how strange it was, to be so calm in the middle of danger. How after enough missions your body adapted, learned to fly while your mind hovered somewhere between focus and distance, because it had to, because staying on high alert for hours would break you otherwise, and so you found the balance, the space where you could stay sharp without burning out. And James had found that space now, letting his hands rest light on the controls, fingers barely moving, eyes scanning the sky in gentle arcs, while part of his brain drifted toward the familiar memories that floated in and out during flights like this. The sound of Emily's voice reading a letter aloud on the last night of leave. The way Claire had once drawn a picture of his Spitfire and mailed it to him with the caption, "Fly safe, Jimmy." Scrawled in pencil, the smell of his mother's kitchen in winter, all those small moments that came back to him in fragments between danger, as if the mind clung to the quietest things when the sky was loudest, and he thought about how every man in his squadron carried their own version of these memories, folded into pockets, stitched into the seams of jackets, whispered into oxygen masks before the first enemy fighters appeared. And today they hadn't appeared yet, but James knew they would, because the Luftwaffe didn't leave bomber runs alone. For long, and somewhere beyond the clouds, somewhere over the horizon, enemy planes were climbing right now, engines roaring, pilots tightening their gloves, adjusting goggles, making their own small rituals before the clash. And he wondered who they were, what they thought about when they climbed into their cockpits. If they whispered names too, if they carried lucky charms, if they feared the same things. And the thought didn't make him feel softer toward them. It just made the war heavier, more complicated, because you couldn't help but think of the enemy as people sometimes, and yet you still had to pull the trigger when the time came, still had to fire first, or risk not coming home. And he pushed that thought aside for now, locked it away in the mental box where he stored everything that didn't serve the mission, and he refocused on the present moment, on the bomber formation below him, their slow, steady flight like ships crossing an invisible sea of air, their gun turrets scanning for threats, and he imagined the gunners inside, hands cold on triggers, eyes darting across the sky just like his, and he felt the weight of their trust, knew they depended on him and his squadron to keep the enemy at bay, to clear the sky long enough for them to drop their payloads and turn for home. And he let that purpose settle into his chest, steadying his breathing, keeping his mind sharp even as the hours dragged on. And the radio crackled now and then, position reports, small status checks, clipped words that cut through the hum of the engine, but didn't break the quiet of his thoughts. And James checked his fuel gauge again, tapped it once with a gloved finger, part of the habit, part of the ritual, and his eyes stayed on the clouds, looking for movement, for shapes that didn't belong. And then it happened, the shift in the air, the subtle change in the tone of the squadron's formation, as one of the wingmen called out a contact 12 o'clock high, multiple bogies, closing fast, and James felt his stomach tighten, but his hands stayed loose, his breath stayed even, because this was the moment they trained for, the moment the sky flipped from calm to combat in the space of a breath. And he squinted toward the horizon, saw the specks growing larger, Messerschmitts again, coming in from altitude with the sun at their backs, and he banked slightly to get a better angle, calling out his own sighting over the radio, his voice steady, no panic in the tone, just the facts. And then the squadron leader's voice came back, assigning pairs, splitting the formation to intercept. And James rolled into position, his Spitfire slicing through the air, climbing into the path of the attackers, and the world narrowed now, the quiet of routine replaced by the clarity of engagement. Everything moving faster, but also slower, the way time does in combat, and he picked out his target, a Messerschmitt breaking from the formation, diving toward the bombers, and James moved to intercept, rolling left, nose down, throttle forward, engine roaring in his ears, and he lined up the shot, pressed the trigger, felt the shudder of the guns beneath his hands, saw the tracers streak ahead, saw the enemy plane jink, right, pulling away, but not fast enough. A burst of rounds hit the wing, smoke trailing, and the Messerschmitt peeled off, diving into the clouds below. And James didn't follow. He knew better than to chase into cloud. Cover, knew that the rest of the fight was still happening around him. So he pulled back into position, scanning for the next threat, eyes flicking left and right, breath steady in his mask, and he saw another pair of enemy fighters breaking through, angling for the bombers again, and he banked into them, closing. Fast, his world a blur of sky and speed and instinct, and he fired again, short, controlled bursts, conserving ammunition, and one of the enemy planes rolled away, diving out of the fight, but the other pressed on, and James matched him turn for turn, staying close, staying patient, because dogfights weren't about panic. They were about timing, about angles, about knowing when to shoot and when to hold back. And he waited for the right moment, closed. The gap, saw the enemy pilot glance back, just for a second, but long enough, and James squeezed the trigger, felt the vibration again, saw pieces of the enemy plane scatter into the air, saw the canopy fly off, the pilot bailing out, and for a split second he thought about that man, wondered if his parachute would open, wondered where he'd land, but he pushed the thought away again, because the fight wasn't over, not yet, and he rolled back into position, scanning the sky for the next threat, checking the bombers, counting, his squadron mates in his peripheral vision, and his hands stayed steady, his breath stayed slow, because that was how you survived, how you lived through dogfight after dogfight without letting the fear win. And eventually, after more turns, more dives, more bursts of gunfire, the sky cleared again, the enemy peeling away, their fuel running low, their attacks losing momentum, and the bombers pressed on, still flying, still whole for the most part. And James let the tension ease from his shoulders, just slightly, but kept his focus sharp, because the flight home was still ahead. And he checked his instruments again, checked his fuel, checked his ammo, and he whispered Emily's name into his mask, whispered Claire's too, the same as always, because that was part of the ritual, part of staying grounded even when you were 20,000 feet above the earth. And he flew on, eyes on the horizon, heart steady, mind clear, because this was what he did. This was who he was now, a man in the sky trying to keep the pieces of his life together while the world below kept turning. The return flight after a battle was always quieter than the outward journey, not because the engines roared any softer or the radios went silent, but because something shifted inside each pilot once the shooting stopped, once the enemy planes peeled away and the formation reassembled, and Lieutenant James Holloway felt that shift now as he flew his Spitfire in tight formation alongside the bombers, his eyes scanning the thinning clouds, his breath steady inside the oxygen mask, the taste of rubber still sharp on his tongue, even after hours at altitude. And there was no chatter in his headset anymore, except for the occasional call-out of fuel check here, a position report there, but otherwise the sky was a muted space again, the storm of the dogfight fading into memory even as the smell of gunpowder lingered faintly in the cockpit, and James flexed his fingers one at a time, feeling the ache in his joints from gripping the stick so long. The tension still coiled in his muscles, even though the worst of the day was behind them. And he thought about the enemy pilots, wondered where they'd gone, whether they were limping back to their own airfields now, planes damaged, fuel low, hearts pounding the same way his had pounded during the last engagement. And he thought about the parachute he'd seen opening in the distance, a small white dot falling toward the earth, and he tried not to imagine what that pilot was thinking, drifting down into territory that might be friendly or hostile, depending on the wind, depending on luck, and James adjusted his heading slightly, correcting for drift. his eyes moving in practiced sweeps from horizon to instruments to the bombers below. Because the job wasn't done yet, the bombers still had to make it home, and so did he. And that thought carried its own weight, heavier now, because he knew someone was missing. Another pilot gone, another friend not coming back to the field. And the formation had that empty space again, that silent marker of loss that no one spoke about over the radio, but everyone felt. A gap like a tooth knocked out of a smile, and James swallowed hard, his throat dry despite the oxygen, because no matter how many times it happened, you never got used to the absences. To the way 1 minute a man was there flying beside you, and the next he was smoke and wreckage, his voice gone from the channel, his playing a spiral of metal, falling toward the indifferent ground below. And James thought about the letter that would be written tonight, the belongings that would be gathered, the bunk that would be stripped. And he hated that part. Hated that death became a routine, just like checking the oil pressure or adjusting the trim. And he carried that thought with him now, tucked behind the focus, behind the calm he showed on the surface, because you couldn't fly if you let it overwhelm you, couldn't hold the stick steady if you let the grief take up too much space in your chest. So you folded it away, packed it into the same pocket where you kept your fear, kept your memories. And James touched the coin in his flight suit again, the one Emily had given him, warm now from his body heat, despite the cold at altitude. And he let it ground him, let it keep his mind from wandering too far into the dark places. And he whispered her name softly inside the mask, the sound lost beneath the hum of the engine. And he whispered Claire's name too, because that was the pattern, the ritual, the way he stayed connected to something real while floating above. A world that often didn't feel real at all. And he thought about home, about the streets he used to walk, about the radio in his mother's kitchen crackling with news reports that made the war sound cleaner than it was, simpler than it was, and he wished he could sit at that kitchen table right now, just for a few minutes, hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea, the air heavy with the smell of bread baking in the oven. But instead he was here, at 20,000 feet, eyes sharp, hands steady, flying through a sky that pretended to be peaceful, even though it wasn't. And he thought about the mechanics back at base, about Tommy, probably standing by the runway already, looking up at the formation as it returned, counting planes, realizing who was missing before anyone said a word. And James hated that part, too. Hated the way death reached not just the pilots, but the ground crews, the cooks, the medics, everyone who watched the sky and waited for familiar shapes to land, for engines to cut out, for canopies to slide back. And he thought about how fragile life was up here, how thin the line between coming home and disappearing could be, thinner than the layer of clouds beneath him, thinner than the steel skin of his Spitfire. And he tightened his grip on the stick just slightly, reminded himself to stay alert, because it wasn't over yet. Not until the wheels touched down, and sometimes not even then, because the mind kept flying long after the plane stopped moving. And he knew that too well by now, knew that sleep would be hard again tonight, that the faces would come back in the dark, the sounds, the sights, the memories looping on a reel that never fully stopped. And he wondered how many other pilots carried the same reel in their heads, how many sat in their bunks at night, staring at the ceiling, trying to breathe quietly so no one heard them awake. And he thought about writing a letter to Emily when he got back, or maybe not writing this time, maybe just sitting with the paper in his lap, pencil in hand, letting the words stay in his head where they felt safer, because some things didn't fit on paper, not really. And he let that thought drift as he checked his fuel again, tapped the gauge like he always did, eyes scanning the sky, watching the horizon, knowing that the coastline wasn't far now, that the return to base was minutes away. But it felt like hours, because time bent strangely after combat, the seconds stretching long, the minutes folding in on themselves. And he wondered if he'd ever be able to explain that feeling to anyone who hadn't flown in war, wondered if he'd even try, or if he'd just carry it quietly for the rest of his life. And he thought about the man who was missing today, wondered if his family would ever know exactly what had happened. Probably not, because sometimes no one saw the final moments. Sometimes a plane just went down into cloud cover and never came out, and the reports stayed vague, and the answers stayed soft-edged, and James hated that too. But he also knew it was the nature of war, of air combat, and he let that knowledge settle into his bones as the squadron closed in on the airfield. The familiar shapes of hangars and runways coming into view below, the fields green and soft. From this height, and he kept his focus sharp, because landing was its own kind of danger, especially after hours in the air, when the body was tired, when the mind wanted to relax too soon, and he checked his instruments again, adjusted his descent, listened to the calls over the radio as the bombers lined up to land, their engines groaning as they came down heavy with empty bomb bays and bullet holes in their wings. And James followed suit, easing his Spitfire into approach. Flaps down, gear down, eyes on the strip of tarmac ahead, hands steady, breath slow, and the plane touched down with a gentle bump, tires gripping the earth again, the vibration of flight giving way to the vibration of wheels on the ground, and he taxied toward the hangar, canopy sliding back, cold air rushing into his face, and he felt the shift again, a moment when the sky let go of him, when the flight became memory, and his boots hit the ground, his legs unsteady for just a second before they found their strength, and Tommy was there waiting, eyes meeting his, no words needed, just a nod, just a glance that said everything that he was back. That someone wasn't, that the day had cost them again, and James walked away from the plane slowly, the sweat cooling on his back despite the cold air, and he looked up at the sky one more time, soft and empty now, pretending to be gentle, and he wondered how many more times he'd have to climb into it before this was over. And he whispered the names again, Emily, Claire, just under his breath, letting them hold him together as he stepped back into the waiting world of the ground. Evening came slowly to the airfield, not with the sudden darkness of combat, but with the gradual softening of light, the long shadows stretching across the tarmac, the hum of engines finally silenced, and Lieutenant James Holloway stood by the edge of the hangar, flight jacket unzipped, his goggles hanging around his neck, his gloves shoved into his pockets, his eyes watching the last of the bombers taxi to their spots. Engines coughing as they powered down, the propellers slowing to a halt like the beating of a tired heart, and the mechanics were already moving toward them, rolling tool carts, checking for damage, wiping sweat from faces that were as weary as the pilots who had flown, and James let his gaze drift across the airfield, counting the planes automatically, his stomach tightening when he came to the space where one of his squadron should have been, the gap sharp as a missing tooth, another man gone, another name that would soon be written on a board somewhere, another locker that would be cleaned, out quietly after dinner when the barracks went still. And he thought about how many times this had happened now, how many flights had ended like this, how many nights he had stood in this exact spot, watching the same horizon fade into dusk, and he knew he wasn't alone in it. The other pilots were doing the same thing, walking slowly back toward the barracks, their heads down, their hands loose at their sides, the exhaustion in their shoulders, not just from the flying, but from the weight of what they carried home in silence. And James reached into his pocket for the coin Emily had given him, turning it between his fingers, the cool metal grounding him, reminding him that he was still here, still breathing, still standing on the earth instead of falling through the sky. And he thought about writing to her tonight, thought about what he would say, whether he would tell her about the man they'd lost today, about the way the dogfight had unfolded, the way the sky had lit up with tracers again, the way his hands had stayed steady on the stick, even though his heart had hammered behind his ribs. But he knew he wouldn't tell her all of that. Not really. Because how could you put into words the feeling of watching a friend's plane vanish into smoke, of seeing parachutes that sometimes opened and sometimes didn't, of landing back on solid ground while part of you still floated somewhere above the clouds, caught between survival and guilt, between relief and grief. And so he would probably write about the small things again, the weather, the food, the jokes the ground crew made while patching bullet holes in the wings. And he would fold the letter carefully, slide it into the same envelope he always used, and hope that by the time she read it, he would still be alive to write the next one. And he thought about Claire, too. His little sister, probably home from school by now, probably setting the table for dinner. Her world still simple, still safe, and he wanted to keep it that way. Wanted her to grow up in a world where the sky was just sky, where airplanes were. Things you watched from the ground with wonder, not machines you climbed into with the knowledge that each flight might be your last. And he thought about how he would explain all of this if he made it home, if the war ever ended. If there came a day when he could sit in a chair by the window and tell stories about the time he'd spent in the air, and he wondered which stories he'd tell, the funny ones. Probably the ones about mechanics cursing at frozen fuel lines, about breakfast rations swapped under the table, about the ridiculous bets made over cups of weak tea in the mess hall. But not the ones about the fear, not the ones about the way your stomach dropped when the enemy planes appeared, about the way the world narrowed down to crosshairs in breath and the split-second decision to fire or die, because some stories belong to the sky alone, and James knew he would carry those quietly, locked away in the same mental box where he kept the memories of the men who didn't come back. And he looked down at his boots now, scuffed and worn from months of pacing the same tarmac, and he thought about how much of his life had been spent up there, in the cold, thin air above, the clouds, and how strange it felt to stand still again, to feel gravity pull him back toward the earth. And he wondered if he would ever stop hearing the engine hum in his bones, ever stop seeing the flicker of tracer fire behind his eyelids when he closed his eyes. And he doubted it, because war had a way of staying with you, of settling into your skin in ways you couldn't wash off. And he accepted that now, not with bitterness, but with a kind of quiet resignation, because this was his life, and he had chosen it. Or maybe it had chosen him, and he would fly again tomorrow, because that's what pilots did. They climbed back into the cockpit, no matter how tired they were, no matter how many friends they'd lost, because the war wasn't over, and someone had to fly. And James let that truth sit in his chest as he walked slowly back toward the barracks, the sky behind him turning darker, the stars beginning to show through the fading light. And he paused at the door for a moment, listening to the quiet hum of the airfield, the low murmur of mechanics still at work, the soft voices of pilots inside the building, some already asleep, some writing letters, some staring at the ceiling, lost in their own thoughts. And he stepped inside, his boots creaking on the wooden floor, and he went to his bunk, sat down heavily, pulling off his flight jacket, folding it neatly beside him, and he reached for the small notebook he kept in his locker, the one where he sometimes wrote things he couldn't say out loud. And he opened it now, the pages filled with messy scrawls from other nights like this. And he picked up his pencil, letting it rest against the paper for a moment, and then he began to write, not about the fight, not about the missing man, but about the sky, about the way the clouds looked from above today, soft and golden in the morning light, and about the way the engine sounded when it was running smooth, and about the smell of oil on his gloves. And he let the pencil move without worrying about what made sense, because sometimes it wasn't about making sense. It was about keeping your hands busy, about keeping your mind steady, about surviving the hours between flights. And when he finished, he closed the notebook, slid it back into the locker, and lay down on his bunk, staring at the ceiling, his hands folded over his chest, the coin still warm in his pocket. And he whispered Emily's name again, whispered Claire's too, and then he let his eyes close. Let the day slip away, knowing that in a few hours the morning would come again. And with it another flight, another climb into the cold air, another day of scanning the sky for threats, another day of breathing in rhythm with the engine, of flying not just for the mission, but for the men who had already fallen, for the ones who still stood beside him, and for the promise he had made to himself in the quiet moments between battles, to keep going, to keep flying, to come back if he could, and to carry the stories home if he couldn't.